Welcome everyone, I'm your host, Emerson Green. So, two Christian apologists reviewed my series on the moral argument for God on a channel called Democracy of the Dead. This was about 6 months ago. I recorded my own counter-response shortly thereafter, but I decided against releasing it. Generally speaking, it's good to remain dispassionate in these online spaces, but my frustration got the better of me because their video was extremely low quality. But I changed my mind about releasing it. I think my response makes sense in hindsight, and I trust that you in the audience can discern why I'm reacting as I do. My exasperation was entirely the product of their errors and oversights and misunderstandings, all of which were completely avoidable if they had put 1/10 of the effort into their video that I put into mine. And their mistakes are not just philosophical. They frequently misunderstood what was being said, or for what purpose it was being said, and even who was saying it at certain points. It was an extremely tedious video to review, but I hope that my commentary on it makes it interesting, or at least entertaining. So with that, here's my 3.5-hour review.
Welcome to Counter-Apologetics.
So I made a series of episodes about the moral argument for God, and posted it as a YouTube video called The Collapse of the Moral Argument. It got 17,000 views on YouTube, plus the usual few thousand on the podcast feed. And the responses to this video have been overwhelmingly positive. And the negative responses are from people who are morons. Like, we can just objectively, we can just look in the comments and I can show you what I'm talking about. I'm not going to do that here, but if you excuse me, look at the 1,300 plus comments on the video, then you'll see what I'm talking about. But anyway, there's been one response video from a channel called Democracy of the Dead, based on the 2 minutes of it that I watched in preparation. This is kind of a low quality video. It's almost 2 hours long, and I don't even know if I'll watch the whole thing, actually. I'm just going to do this until it stops being fun.
So we're going to start here at about the 4-minute mark. Let's do it.
An astounding number of people are inclined to think differently. They think that morality is objective only if God exists. Without a divine moral lawgiver, an astounding number of people are inclined to think differently. From what? Why did you start the video at that sentence? Anyway, so I just have the moral argument for God up on the screen. Morality is objective only if God exists. Morality is objective, therefore God exists. And MJ is nodding furiously, and he's here with his co-host, Chris. There would be no objective moral truths, but clearly there are objective moral truths. So with those premises in hand, we have an argument for God, one of the most popular ones in existence. If you're like...
Now, real quick, can I do a little commentary? Are you going to put up your hand whenever the sound bite was about to be done? As you were...
Yeah, did I put 356? I have 440 as the first one.
440? All right, I'll keep going, but I'll just say this real quick. Right now, with the presentation of the argument, where we're at right now is the Speed Watkins, the Blake level of argumentation, where you just put love you, Blake. Well, the structure of the argument has been given. We're good. That's all we got to do. That's all of Blake's tweets.
Oh yeah, Blake. Yeah,
the fuck are you talking about? Like, we're at the Ben Watkins level of argumentation, of just posting the argument, plus just like the random shitting on Ben for, oh, love you, Ben. Also, you're a complete moron because you just post arguments without what? Defending every single premise with a book?
The structure of the argument has been given. We're good. That's all we got to do.
I think he's trying to be funny, but like, I don't know what the joke is. And the argument I posted was your argument, not mine. I posted the structure of your argument that you endorse. And we're at the 4-minute mark of a 2-hour video. Do you think maybe I'm going to go into the structure of that argument in a little more depth? It just is like such a weird fucking point to pause the video and be like, oh, wow, look at the shallowness of this. He's just giving the structure of the argument. Yeah, we're at the beginning of a video about the argument, so what the fuck else would I do? Also, why are you shitting on Ben for just tweeting out arguments?
That's all of Blake's tweets.
Oh yeah, Blake. Yeah, he's. I mean, I agree with him on.
For those who don't know, Ben's full name is Benjamin Blake Speed Watkins. That's why they're calling him that.
A good number of things. My first exchange with him was not very good.
Oh no.
Because I was giving first cause arguments, and then he came in very angry. But
well, he's a Hegelian. I mean, these people are kind of by themselves at the lunch table right now. But you know, there's a resurgence going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was also a group. It was also a Christian group, so it was a group that like wouldn't have been, you know, amenable to his views. So, you know,
gotcha.
it's not surprising. I mean, it's not surprising.
And then with his lightsaber already engaged.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe somebody, because you know, people aren't that nice on the internet, obviously. So maybe someone said something to him or treated him badly, and he came in kind of annoyed already and kind of defensive. That went away actually pretty quickly, like in the first one or two posts. But
you showed him Thor's hammer a little too quick.
No, he's actually just a nice guy.
Take it easy, man.
Yeah, well, he knew I wasn't. Well, because if I think he assumed I was just kind of spouting stuff and like people do. And then once he saw what I was talking about, and then I wasn't actually attacking atheists for very stupid reasons. You know,
got it.
So.
All right, proceeding to the 40th second of this 4th minute.
Like me, then you accept one of those premises, the one about the reality of moral truths, but you reject the other premise about God being required for moral objectivity. But moral anti-realists should also be able to see the issues I'll raise with the idea that objective morality must be grounded in God, or even can be grounded in God.
Yeah, that's where
we're not taking them out of context, right?
No, that's actually where it starts. So that's where the quote comes in at 440.
We have reached zero substance yet of this video. They're pausing it every 10 seconds. So I'm just like, so the moral argument is an argument, and then they pause and talk for 3 minutes.
Answering.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, yeah. What is your do you have any commentary you want to make on this first? What are they called? Timestamps?
I'm going to bump this up to 1.25 speed. Sorry if you're already listening to me on faster.
No, we can probably just go through this.
Why the fuck did you pause it? What are you doing? What is this fucking channel? All right, we've paused at the first timestamp. This is a video. We're watching it. We've paused it. Do you have any comments? No. Okay. Why the fuck am I watching this?
We're letting Emerson speak for himself.
Yeah. And by the way, he's a pretty cordial guy. Like,
oh yeah, he's nothing like Blake.
Like he's, geez. No, he seems pretty nice and pretty.
Ben is a lot nicer than me.
Open, you know. Yeah. For the most part, he's talked to plenty of philosophers and people. So I mean, I don't have any personal problem with him at all. But I disagree with 80% of stuff he says while in the video. I do think it was helpful for him to go through the.
Which part about it being intrinsically wrong to torture babies? Is that the part you disagree with?
You go through meta ethics. It's good people know that. And actually, I think the primary point of the video was actually more like the moral argument in the first premise. You need to do more work. And I agree. I completely agree with that. That's why I wrote my master's thesis on the first premise.
Oh, shit.
Literally. So
this is not.
I didn't know that. That's funny. So his guest wrote a master's thesis defending the idea that morality is objective only if God exists. Okay, well, that's cool.
Publicly available right now, right? Kind of took it off.
No, my plan was to write that and to make it into several separate papers, publish those, and then get into a PhD program, and then publish something larger and more comprehensive.
That's awesome. Godspeed, man.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of the work of this argument is being done at that first premise. If it's going to be an argument for God's existence, and that's why that explains why these moral realists are going to have a problem with it, predictably. All right.
Well, yeah, because the second premise is just stuff is objectively wrong, and then Craig's defense of it is just intuition. He's like, which is the same point that I come back to over and over again, which is like, hey, the only reason we think stuff is right or wrong is because we have moral intuitions. Like stuff seems right or wrong to us, and that's Craig's justification for the second premise too.
Yeah.
So okay, it's set up now. You had 625 to 808 after 1229. Was that by design?
No, I just I think that was by accident. I think I added some things in there. If you play, so the timestamps are where it starts. So like at 440, right, is where he says something that we can respond to.
Oh my god.
Oh, at 440.
Yeah, at the time marks. Yeah.
Okay, because I went to 420. like a weirdo. Sorry about that.
The level of effort that went into my video and the level of effort into this response is, there's quite a difference between those two levels of fucking effort.
All right, proceeding. I'm going to get fired. Sorry about that.
So my radical claim is that in order for something to be wrong, like torturing a baby, we don't need to find out whether God exists first. We can just see that it's wrong to torture a baby without stopping, like, wait a second, does God exist? Because I can't really decide whether it's good or bad or neither good nor bad to torture a baby until we answer the question about God first. Even if God exists.
Yeah, that was it. So that was
I'm chomping at the bit right now. I'm chomping
We're 5 minutes into this video.
at the bit.
Yeah, so, I mean, so that was it right there. And I don't know. I honestly don't know of a single theist who argues this, that you need to somehow establish in your own mind that God exists before you can actually recognize something as right or wrong. This seems like, right, it's a recognition, it's an epistemic concept. So you can recognize plenty of things that are right or wrong without going into metaphysics of why it is that way, or further explanations of why it is that way. We do this all the time, right? And I don't know of any theists that argues that you have to do this. So yeah, we don't need to find out whether God exists first. And most people don't. Your
entire fucking argument is that if God doesn't exist, there is no right or wrong. So, I mean, yeah, like unreflectively, I can just say it's wrong to torture a baby. But if I'm a careful philosophical thinker and I'm reflecting upon these moral issues, I think, well, hang on, morality is objective only if God exists. So, you know what I mean? Like, and if I think that God doesn't exist, then this isn't wrong. And if I think God does exist, then I guess, I can say that it's wrong to, punish the innocent or something. So yeah, I mean, I'm putting this in kind of a snarky way. I'm trying to put it in a way that makes it vivid why I think this argument is stupid, which is like, obviously, whether or it's good or bad or neither good nor bad, that doesn't hinge on God's existence. Like it's the features of the act itself, the intrinsic features of the act of torturing a baby. That is what makes it wrong. That's the truth maker for it's wrong to torture a baby. What's happening in that act, in that situation. Like that is those are the truth makers. It's the intrinsic features of the act. It's not God's, opinion on the matter that makes it good or bad or neither good nor bad. But yeah, if you're being properly reflective, then it seems like you do have to figure out whether God exists if you can say it's bad or good or neither good nor bad. That's the point of the moral argument. So you're kind of pretending to not understand the point here, in my view. You're saying, well, epistemically, you can make this judgment. You can just say, I think it's wrong without yeah, I understand that people walk around making moral judgments, but you're, as a defender of the moral argument, you're saying you cannot judge something as bad objectively without God.
Don't talk about foundations a lot. And that's the complaint of this video, and it's my complaint as well, as most people talk about ethics and never go up the step to the foundation or the meaning of moral terms, which has been huge recently. So like moral semantics has actually been pretty big recently, such that you have a lot of YouTube sensationalist videos coming out that are denying even the second premise, being anti-realism.
Okay. They're denying the second premise. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
Or they're denying that the second premise has any kind of truth value at all.
Yeah, or it's meaningful or it's even coherent. Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff. So
now that's why I included that clip from Craig's graphic video for 3-year-olds at the end of our intro, where the guy saves the cat from the tree without believing in God. So there you go. Atheists can be moral. So I feel like this idea of recognition or deciding and deliberating about whether or not God exists before you can determine whatever you're doing is good or bad. All these are just iterations on a theme, variations of a theme. The theme of, for some reason, and this came up over and over again in that book, in that debate with Craig, the red one, is goodness without God good enough, I think it's called. They just keep going back to these epistemic these epistemic points. You do not need to establish anything epistemically as it relates to God before you can be good or bad. We're saying on a metaphysical level.
I didn't say anything about being good without God. I was talking about making judgments about, is this proposition true or false, or neither true nor false. I said nothing about being good without God.
On a grounding level.
Yeah.
God needs to be there in order for there to be good and bad. And then the commands.
Yeah, and that was my point. My point was, isn't it silly to think that it is in fact neither good nor bad to torture a baby if God doesn't exist? That's why I was putting it in that, admittedly slightly rhetorical way, but like I don't think it was that hard to understand what I was saying. Oh, gee, I need to figure out whether God exists before I can, figure out whether this is actually bad or not. I mean, I'm talking about grounding. I'm not talking about being good without God. I'm talking about this metaphysical, ontological grounding that you're saying I'm too fucking stupid to get that that's what you guys are talking about. That's exactly what I'm talking about. I didn't say anything about being good without God. You brought that up.
God before you can be good or bad. We're saying on a metaphysical level, a grounding level, God needs to be there in order for there to be good and bad. And then the commands are related right wrong. Yeah. And I feel like Emerson, I don't see how he doesn't know this. So maybe he's just caught up in the power of the example. Because when you think about it, a baby being tortured, I mean, you don't think about God at all. You want to keep it from being tortured.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, maybe he did come across somebody who said this. I don't know. Like, I've never heard this from especially any academic. But
holy shit! I mean, this is like a theme in the responses to this that I've noticed. Like in the comments and stuff. Like one person got extremely worked up about the opening line where I was like, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and morality," and they were just like nitpicking that. I'm like, that was just supposed to be like kind of a fun way of opening it, and then I like gave this thought experiment about God like shaking up a magic 8-ball to decide what the moral law will be, and they were just like really, really nitpicking that like scenario, and I was like, I think you're taking that scenario a little too seriously. I'm trying to illustrate what I think is the case, which is that if God gave us moral commands, there were moral reasons for giving those commands. Like he's aware of the moral reasons which exist independently of him. That's what I was trying to say. Like the idea that like prior to God, like torturing a baby is neither good nor bad until God, stands in some relation to it. Like that was the point. You're taking the thought experiment too seriously. And then these guys are now saying like, well, hang on. He said we need to figure out whether God exists before we can judge whether it's bad to torture a baby. It's like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it would be insane to do that, to say that like, well, I mean, I'm not just going to repeat myself, but the point about metaphysical grounding, I'm saying that like, I think we can safely say this proposition, it's wrong to punish the innocent or what have you. This proposition is true. And like, God doesn't have to stand in any particular relation to it. I'm just like basically finding a different way of putting the moral realist position that hopefully makes it more intuitive. And they're getting all hung up on this stuff about like being good without God. And did any theist ever actually say this, that we have to figure out whether God exists before we can, make this judgment or something? A bit of a theme in the replies. It's just like in this opening section, keep in mind, we are in the opening section called The Big Picture, where I just kind of try to summarize how I see this. That's as far as we are right now.
Been like the layperson, like I've never heard anybody actually say this. I've heard other atheists say this. Like when it comes to abduction, right? You need to establish the entity in the abducted hypothesis in order to actually work as evidence or something. Yeah. But I've never heard theists say this before.
Now, are you talking about these guys right here? I only wanna be by your side. Sorry.
I wonder what the volume level is. Like,
I don't know.
If we're just talking and it comes up with that, and then it's just like 3 times the volume level.
Craig's not alone. All right, he's got company.
Yeah, and we're gonna go over that later too.
They all.
Oh, okay. So the point of that fucking way too loud sound effect and with the books on screen is that there are academic defenses of divine command theory. Okay, you want to talk about academic defenses of moral realism? I mean, I mentioned that at fucking 8 minutes into the video, which we're apparently never going to get that fucking far. But you really want to start polling philosophers about what they think about this? Is that really a can of worms you want to open up?
That's the first problem we're having with Emerson Green's video. I mean, right away at 440.
Is that what you don't fucking understand what I'm saying? That's your main problem with it?
They're wrong. He's framing it in epistemic terms, and Craig is talking about ontology. He's talking about metaphysics. He's talking about grounding. Yeah. Grounding is a concept.
I failed to consider ontology and grounding in this video. That is fair.
It makes no sense unless you're talking about a thing that exists, accounting for or explaining or bringing about or.
Yeah, and as I repeatedly said in the video, it's like the intrinsic features of the act.
Being such as to be able to have this thing up here supervene on it or whatever. some kind of grounding relation. And we're saying that God is the necessary grounding.
Yeah, and
that's the
I mean,
thesis.
and people do make plenty of decent epistemological points.
How the fucking shit do you think I don't understand that? Like, did you watch the video? Do you think I don't understand this argument is about grounding morality?
Right. But in my work, the majority of the time, I've actually got I'm much more familiar with metaphysics, more of a metaphysicist than I am a epistemologist. Right. So I tend to focus on the.
Dude, I love that. He said I'm more of a metaphysicist than an epistemologist. He didn't say metaphysician. He said metaphysicist. That's fucking sick, dude. We should start saying that. Instead of metaphysicians, we should call them metaphysicists. That's way cooler.
Much more familiar with metaphysics, more of a metaphysicist than I am a epistemologist. Right. So I tend to focus on the metaphysics. So when epistemology comes up, you'll probably see me. I know it, but I don't know it nearly as well. And I'd be like one like McNabb or something like, hey, you heard this before?
He's done all the dirty work. And then an analogy that I'll use and I'll kick to death is, if I'm determining whether or not the light from my flashlight is sufficient to find my keys in the dark, I don't have to think about photons, even though without photons, there'd be no light. That's exactly what we're saying. We're not saying that the guy needs to deliberate about the properties of photons before he knows whether or not his flashlight's finding the keys in the dark room. People knew about light for hundreds of thousands of years prior to the discovery of photons. What is that, 20th century, or is that Maxwell? Anyway, but that's the point. That's what we're doing. That's what we're saying about God. Okay, you don't need to even know about God or how he plays a role.
Okay, so that's a fair point. I guess it's not nitpick them and try to see the spirit of what they're saying. So the spirit of what they're saying is, hey, you're mixing up moral ontology and epistemology. You keep saying, well, obviously I have moral knowledge, therefore moral realism. And it's like, well, I mean, I think that is a valid move. I mean, first of all, like saying that, like, well, I have moral knowledge, and like I'm going to account for this in moral realist terms. I'm not going to try to give some kind of error theory or something about how I think I have moral knowledge or something. But yeah, I mean, if I'm going to talk about moral ontology and moral grounding, then I'm going to at certain points talk about moral epistemology and moral knowledge and all that. Like, I think that some people just hear that it's sort of like fallacies, like they get some idea in their head, like, okay, stuff that kind of sounds like this is a fallacy. And then I'm just going to wait for that kind of stimulus to come in. And then I'm going to react to it. Like, that's fallacious. So if you criticize me on any level, then I'm going to say ad hominem, even if it's like not an ad hominem, or it is, but it's not fallacious or whatever. Like, if, you have significant material interests at stake, like we find out that like Shell Oil is funding all this, anti-climate change propaganda stuff, if you can even imagine such a thing, then we might say, well, they've got material interests at stake, so I'm not sure that they're the most trustworthy sources on this kind of thing. You couldn't just say, oh, ad hominem. And I think that there's a similar thing going on here with separating moral ontology and epistemology. Like, of course, those have to be distinguished. But I feel like every time I mention intuition or knowledge or anything, they're just like, oh, God, this fucking moron just doesn't understand. There's a distinction between epistemology and ontology. It's like, I think that you're kind of missing the forest for the trees here. Like, I'm making a certain point, but you just notice that I'm invoking a concept of like knowledge or intuition, or I'm like making a judgment or something. And then you're like, here it goes again, conflating ontology and epistemology.
These are for the people that are like theorizing about the relationship between.
But yes, of course, we can have certain knowledge without knowing how it's grounded. Like, I know that 2 and 2 equal 4, but I don't know if Platonism is true or nominalism is true or divine conceptualism or, some kind of weird middle way or something. Like, I have no idea. But regardless of any of that, I know that 2 + 2 = 4. So I have mathematical knowledge, even though I don't know how to ground it. Or I don't know the proper way of grounding it or the best way of grounding it. And my opinion about that will likely change many times before I ever settle on a view, or if I ever settle on a view. And yet, the entire time, I know that 2 + 2 = 4. So, that's a good point. It's worth making, that like, okay, look, regardless of these meta-ethical debates, surely we can agree that it's wrong to torture a baby. We can be good without God. Oh, I don't know. Natural law theory is silly. we can agree about different things in normative and applied ethics and make certain judgments without having to worry about meta-ethical questions. Of course, I agree with that. And if that's their only point, then fine. But I think there's a lot more going on than just that.
Gotten around it. Okay.
Mhm.
I'll probably say that a couple more times.
Okay.
625. Hope everyone is doing good out there. Oh, I'm starting at 626. Back up.
Why am I ever apologizing for like doing a
And
bad
yes,
job streaming and like, oh gosh, I'm sorry guys, that was a bit of an unrelated tangent. And then meanwhile, there's this kind of video that exists. Pulling out virtually every apologist who makes the moral argument with that. A great deal of people who rely on apologetics are genuinely unaware that most philosophers are moral realists. In fact, the majority of atheist philosophers are moral realists, and that defenses of robust moral objectivity have been offered that make no reference to God. In fact, most of them make no reference to God. The influence of Christian apologists has been detrimental to the understanding of philosophy in this area, which is the main reason I wanted to talk about this. The moral argument, one of the most popular arguments for God in the modern age, depends entirely on metaethics. Yet most Christian apologists who write books, give talks, make videos, and podcasts are stunningly ignorant of the basics. As Christian philosopher Kenny Pierce once said on Twitter, I am once again begging, nay, imploring people who want to use metaethics for apologetics to learn literally anything about metaethics. So I'm not just dunking on Christian apologetics here. I'm not just doing that. I want to raise the level of discourse, because right now it sucks. And to be honest, I'm a little put off that I was so misled by Christian apologists on this topic. I wasted a lot of time lost in the useless dialectic between apologists and counter-apologists spawned by the moral argument. And I don't want anyone else to get sucked into the black hole.
Where am I at?
Yeah.
808. Sorry.
Yeah.
808.
Yeah.
Of confusion sustained in existence by apologists and the unfortunate souls who only know about metaethics through them.
Include this.
Yep, I wanted to include the music. So, okay.
The music contextualizes that perfectly.
So there's a number of...
Yeah, they included the whole Chicanito thing. That's funny. I don't know why they're just playing these clips of me, like, giving the big picture and just kind of setting things up and being like, yeah, I think this stuff is dumb. And they're just like, okay, let's pause. Let's pause for a moment. Like, why? Why don't you skip to the part where I, like, make arguments?
Number of things in here. One quick one before I forget, because this is one that I would probably naturally forget. The Phil Paper surveys, take those with a grain of salt, especially like the 2009 version. If you actually look at the universities they go through, so actually this supports his point. It doesn't actually go against it. They're almost all secular. They're almost all, like, almost none of them are religious.
Okay.
Like universities.
They don't pull the seminaries or the
No, they're all. Yeah, at least in the 2020, they polled people from Canada, Europe, and...
Oh man, we should really be polling seminaries about whether there are, like, synthetic a priori truths.
The U.S.
Okay.
And I'm not sure about the 2009, but I do know that you can look at the universities they polled, and they're almost all secular. And so it is nice to. I kind of have mixed feelings. It's actually really nice to see that most of them are more realists, because I think it's true, and I think it should be a more realist because I think it's true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm glad to see that. But if they were being consistent with their atheism, they wouldn't be. That's what I tend to say.
Yeah, shut the fuck up.
And there is a debate over whether relativism, various forms of relativism, should be considered more realism or not. So that doesn't answer the question of exactly where they are on that scale.
I'm going to go ahead and settle that debate right now. No, moral relativism is not a form of moral realism.
And so I agree with him. I think that I think a lot of Christian apologists.
What would moral realism even mean if it included moral relativism? What kind of fucking question is that? What would be the point of dividing these positions up if, like, moral non-naturalism and moral relativism are in the same boat?
I'm not saying they're doing this on purpose, and they're apologists for a reason. Like, that's their thing. I don't really expect them to be able to go into extremely in-depth scientific and philosophical literature in general. I mean, they might have the areas I like to focus on, and they'll learn more about it. But I never really expected them to go into metaethics, right? And so I don't know. I guess that didn't affect.
I mean, you just said atheism is inconsistent with moral realism. So, I mean, that's a very just the point of MJ though. Just like they're not polling the seminaries. Yeah, they're trying to figure out what analytic philosophers think. That's the point of the survey. Why would they poll non-analytic philosophers when they're trying to figure out what analytic philosophers think?
I mean, I know you can talk to more about like the last point he made about kind of feeling duped, and if you just kind of stayed at the apologetic level, like then you all of a sudden you discover there's all these points that nobody ever brought up, and you kind of feel like they were left out for a reason. Almost, it's kind of suspicious.
Well, yeah, because you're making a fucking argument based on meta-ethics when you make the moral argument, and what you're saying is utterly disconnected from the field of meta-ethics. So yeah, it is a little suspicious, but really I think it's more stupidity than like malevolence.
Can I make a point on that? Yeah. I wonder what apologist he's talking about. Yeah. Is he talking about that one guy? Who's that guy?
Frank Turek.
Is he talking about Frank Turek?
I don't know.
Talking about Norman Geisler?
I'm always talking about Frank Turek, baby.
Geisler? Is he talking about Josh McDowell? Like, who's he talking about? Like, what apologist is he talking about?
I said virtually every apologist who makes the moral argument.
I think he's just, I don't know if he has any in mind, or he's just saying in general, like that's kind of a general rule or something.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why I got
even Justin Barley, who's seems like a nice guy. Like, I bought that book. What's it called? Is it called Unbelievable? He had that book where he's like, after talking to atheists for 10 years, and then like you read the book and it's like, holy shit! Like you've just been sitting there with like an empty skull this whole time. Because like I just assumed he was smart.
Into more sophisticated philosophy in the first place, because I read Christian apologetics and it turned me on to the issues, and then I figured out pretty soon that they weren't sufficient to really like completely give you a full org response with all the conceptual dimensions of the different views discussed. And so what I did was I didn't give up my Christianity. I went on to like the more sophisticated Christian philosophers. Unfortunately, I guess one of the guys that we like is also considered an apologist, so he's tainted or something.
Who, Craig?
Because Craig will distill the complexity of these arguments for lay audiences in the context of debates, right? And church talks and stuff like that. But if you read the debate he had with Wielenberg, the theistic the meta-ethical foundations of theistic morality, whatever's on reasonable faith, is goodness without God good enough. He interacts with all these views like on a scholarly level, and
that's true.
He admits that he gets this stuff from Adams and Austin. Are Adams and Austin like morons?
No.
Are they just apologists?
I didn't say. Oh my god! I'm literally distinguishing apologists from philosophers. I'm saying there are analytic philosophers, people involved in metaethics, people who publish papers in metaethics. Then there are apologists. And I'm glad I included that quote from Terence Cuneo in the I think it was Cuneo in Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. It was just a screenshot that August posted, so I can't be sure. But he was like, his criticism of Wielenberg's book was that he spent too much time engaging with the shit that they're talking about right now. He's just like, no one thinks this. He's like, in a way, this is kind of a straw man, because who the fuck thinks this stupid shit? It's like, well, these two guys do. And they're like acting like I'm saying Alston is an idiot or something. And like Robert Adams is a moron. Like, I didn't say that. I just said, I'm talking about apologists right now. And by the way, try to keep naming people. Like, there's Adams, there's Alston, there's Craig. Can you even keep going after that? Like, Terence Cuneo, who's a theist, was writing in that review for Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. He's like, look, nobody thinks this. None of the theists I know think this.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's one unfortunate thing. He uses the word, and he says this. He's not trying to hide anything. He uses the word apologist disparagingly. I don't see why.
I explicitly say that, and then I have a section called apologist, or apologetics or something, where I'm like, here's how I define apologist. Here's who I'm talking about, and here's who I'm not talking about. But I guess they can just keep speculating if they want.
We need to do that, like and he says, and he knows that there are atheist apologists too. The Reason Rally, like there's a whole Reason Rally. Remember that? Remember that thing?
Right, the Arm Rod guy was there.
Yeah, so I mean, there are plenty of, you could say, equally annoying atheist apologists.
And I call them out all the time. I call out atheist apologists all the time. Aaron Ra's a fucking moron.
But I don't really use that word disparagingly. Like, I don't tend to call them apologists. They probably don't use the term as much to refer to themselves.
Who gives
as
a shit?
Do something.
Why does this matter? Oh my god.
So I don't know. I don't really see the need to do that. And when they bring the point up, go ahead.
No, I said hi. Any additional comments from Darwin's Greatest Hits will cost $5.
$5 for each comment. So usually, like when I hear like a Christian apologist like bring up morality on atheism and everything, first off, like I said, I don't expect them to know the literature. Like that's not why they're. I mean, it's not exactly why they're there. They're there to kind of have the basic concepts, but but they very well might, and that'd be great if they did. Like I'm always for the research on that. But I mean, typically their point, isn't that there are no atheists who are moral realists, right? But it's that the number of atheists compared to virtually every other people group on the face of the planet that deny moral realism or are moral nihilists is a much higher proportionally.
Right.
I mean,
oh my God. See, this actually annoys me because I say that like I haven't been annoyed this whole video, but part of that is your fault. Part of that is the fault of apologists who convince people, they convince me for a short time, a very short time, that if God doesn't exist, then nihilism is true. But I was so convinced that God didn't exist that didn't really stop me, even though it was kind of a barrier. But I was like embracing the dark truth. This is like the first 2 weeks I was an atheist, for the record, literally. But this is kind of your fault. Like you're like, oh yeah, geez, there's so many atheist YouTubers and atheist apologists who are moral anti-realists, and it's like, do you think that has anything to do with the fact that almost no one looks into metaethics, but lots of people look into Christian apologetics, who just state it as if it's a fact, like a widely recognized fact, that atheism entails nihilism or that it's incompatible with realism? Do you think that has something to do with it? Maybe.
It's really easy to see this. Just go to Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Reddit, whatever. You can go on there where you can see this everywhere. I have a folder with pictures, like just taking pictures. Like, wow, there's a lot of...
You're taking screenshots of Facebook comments of atheist anti-realists? What kind of point are you attempting to make by doing that?
These people, and every single time they're atheists.
It's kind of like the libertarian compatibilist determinist debate. Like determinists and libertarians agree on a lot of premises, and then they draw different conclusions. That's why Craig will cite like atheists, existentialists, or Dostoevsky that agree with the first premise. Yeah. They agree with the first premise, deny the second. And so the moral realists are kind of like,
so funny. Shut up. It's so funny to be like, oh, Craig, like, he quotes these atheists. And it's like, yeah, Craig, who just dismisses what all these people say in every other fucking context. Suddenly he's very concerned with what they have to say.
Denying the first premise.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't like counting noses because
if you do, then you'll be fucking... Yeah. Very smart of you to count noses, as you put it, and then suddenly be like, but let's not think too deeply about the consensus of relevant experts here.
Come to the conclusions that they came to on the basis of arguments. Let's discuss the arguments.
I'm trying to, but you keep fucking pausing it before I get to them.
But he was also saying stuff like that it was like I'm shocked. I'm shocked that atheists that are moral realists don't agree with the first premise. Well, why is that shocking? Of course they're not going to agree with the first premise. They're atheists. They're atheist moral realists. Why in the heck would they affirm the first premise? Like, I don't see why this is shocking. This is like essentially like indispensable.
Yeah, and there are some atheists that do agree with the first premise. They just deny the second premise.
That's what I mean with the free will parallel. Yeah, exactly. They agree with us, but then deny the second premise.
Yeah,
exactly.
Which is
fascinating.
Pretty terrible, I think. And we might get into later why eventually, because this like buzz on YouTube about anti-realism is annoying me immensely.
I vibe with this Chris guy overall. As much as I've been shitting on some of the things he says, we seem to be in line on pretty much everything except the idea that like non-theistic moral realism is necessarily false.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about somebody. I already said it on Twitter anyway. We'll be discussing the views of Lance Bush. So we're going to discuss what Chris would call quietism.
Yeah, it's quietism about a lot of things. Like thought.
For a quietist, he never shuts the fuck up.
More properties, etc.
All right, so let's go to our next
Folks, why are the quietists always the ones who never shut the fuck up?
Stamp here, which is 12 minutes and 29 seconds. Right there, let's go there. 21 seconds.
Expressed by them are in fact true, and straightforwardly so, in the way ordinary descriptive propositions are straightforwardly true. That's the core of moral realism. At least some positive ethical propositions are straightforwardly true. So consider two objective but descriptive facts. First, the Earth is not flat. It's an oblate spheroid. Second, 7 is greater than 2. They're both non-evaluative facts that obtain regardless of what anyone thinks about them, whether they want them to be true, etc. We know about those quite differently, and in some sense, they seem like different kinds of facts altogether, even though they're both objectively true. The Earth is an oblate spheroid, and 7 is greater than 2. And as you can probably guess, I'm trying to establish a precedent. A, objective facts can fall into different categories. For example, they're not all about the physical world or some such. And B, we can know about objective facts through very different means. The way that we know 7 is greater than 2 is not the same as the way we know that the Earth is an oblate spheroid. He's literally doing the thing I just said, where he just notices someone mentioning knowledge or intuition or making judgments. He's like, more ontology and epistemology, you gotta separate those. This is like the dumbest level of analysis you can have. He has my words on screen and he's like, just not listening very carefully. Like, I'm clearly distinguishing between epistemology and ontology here. Okay, so I said objective facts can fall into different categories. For example, they're not all about the physical world. Okay, so that's a fact about ontology. And then we know about objective facts through different means. And then I end it by saying the broad category of objective facts is not monolithic, ontologically or epistemologically. So I am explicitly distinguishing between them. And he just hears me saying, oh, we know about these things through different means. Ontology, epistemology, same kinds of facts, and we don't all know about them in the same way. As a side note, consider how strange it would be to object at this point and say, oh my God, he just yelled out the word knowledge twice. Here, I'm just going to play it back. He's just yelling out the word knowledge. And then in response to the thing that I just read to you, where I am clearly distinguishing, it's not that I'm conflating ontology and epistemology. I'm clearly distinguishing them. I could not possibly be more clearly like what? Oh my God. Greater than 2 is not the same as the way we know that the Earth is an oblate spheroid. The broad category of objective facts is not monolithic. They don't all seem to be the same kinds of facts, and we don't all know about them in the same way. As a side note, consider how strange it would be to... Good God almighty.
Yeah, so yeah, that's what I had. He said, to ask where facts which is 7 greater than 2, the Earth is an oblate spheroid come from, is misguided, is asking where more facts come from. Well, that hasn't been argued for. It's just kind of been asserted here, right? So, for example, the robust realists believe in abstract objects, propositions, right?
We are in the defining terms section of the video, and I would like to point out that we are 13 minutes and 40 seconds into my video, and I think that's with skipping around. Okay, so that's not even like they've played 13 minutes of me speaking. They've played probably a combined total of 1 minute of me speaking, and we're 30 minutes into their video, and there has been not really any substance so far. Like I said, they picked the part at the beginning where I'm just kind of introducing things, here's how I see it. And they're like, here are all these, supposed problems. And now we're in the defining terms, which is clearly labeled, by the way, defining terms. And he's like, he doesn't argue for this. Bitch, I am defining a word. What are you talking about?
Yes, I mean, those are the truth, those are the truth bearers. Right. And if that's the case, then yes, you do need an explanation for them. Necessity doesn't mean absent of an explanation. Right. It would be eminently reasonable to ask where they came from or why they're necessary. Right. So in their proposition, so they have a very specific nature. Right. So I mean, they're necessary. They're exastic. They're alethic. They're did I say intentional?
No.
Yeah. They're and that they're moral. Right. They're authoritative and synthetic. All of those.
What did you say before synthetic?
Wait.
What did you say before?
Authoritative.
I want to hear that more in context because that sounds crazy.
Of an explanation, right? It would be eminently reasonable to ask where they came from or why they're necessary. Yes.
Go back a little further to object at this point and say, yeah.
So yeah, that's what I had. He said, to ask where facts which is 7 greater than 2, the Earth is an oblate spheroid come from, is misguided, is asking where more facts come from. Well, that hasn't been argued for. It's just kind of been asserted here. Right. So, for example, the robust realists believe in abstract objects, propositions. Right. Yes, I mean, those are the truth. Those are the truth bearers. Right. And if that's the case, then yes, you do need an explanation for them. Necessity doesn't mean absent of an explanation. Right. It would be eminently reasonable to ask where they came from or why they're necessary. Right. So in their proposition, so they have a very specific nature. Right. So I mean, they're necessary. They're exastic. They're alethic. They're did I say intentional?
No.
Yeah, they're and that they're moral, right? They're authoritative and synthetic. All of those.
What did you say before synthetic? What'd you say before?
Authoritative.
Synthetic? Excuse me?
Authoritative.
Come again? That's going to be a key trait.
What the fuck? Are you talking about propositions right now? Like, I'm genuinely confused. They're intentional?
No.
Yeah, they're in that they're moral, right? City doesn't mean absent of an explanation, right? It would be eminently reasonable to ask where they came from or why they're necessary, right? So in their proposition, so they have a very specific nature, right? So I mean, they're necessary. They're loxastic. They're alethic. They're that's intentional.
No.
Yeah, they're in that they're moral, right? They're authoritative and synthetic.
I'm just like actually confused. Like, we might not be using words in the same way. Like, if you're saying a proposition is intentional, I mean, like, in philosophy, intentional states are, about propositions. So, I mean, a proposition itself is not intentional. You have like a mental state about a proposition, like you believe P. Okay, that's in philosophy, that's an intentional state. You have a belief about a proposition. Propositions are what intentional states are about. They are not themselves intentional. So that's an utterly bizarre notion of what a proposition is. And to say they're authoritative, what does that mean? I mean, I guess they're authoritative in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4 is authoritative. But anyway, MJ really wanted to emphasize that point. They're authoritative. Like what? They're morally motivating? Or what? Like, what do you mean authoritative? They'll threaten to send you to hell if you don't comply? What the fuck do you mean authoritative? But anyway, just to say that any proposition is intentional is utterly bizarre, because intentionality is a property of minds and mental states and stuff. Like if you have a belief about a proposition, that's an intentional state.
All of those.
What did you say before synthetic? What'd you say before?
Authoritative.
Excuse me?
Authoritative.
Come again? That's going to be a key trait.
Yeah.
Authoritative.
And they're all those things. And you definitely need an explanation for how in the world they can possibly be any of that. Right? And that just they exist, right? And it's really funny because propositions have a one-to-one correspondence with thoughts, turns out.
Like what he's doing with the sphere propositions.
Propositions have a one-to-one correspondence with thoughts. What the fuck are you talking? I don't even care. I'm moving.
Math propositions. They're harping on truth. And whatever. Put down whatever you think has to be the case for you to know about their truth or whatever. But like in a lot of meta-ethic books that I've read, there is debate about what characteristics or traits that claims need to have for them to be moral in the first place. So if we have like an independent argument that says, look, these for a proposition or a claim to be moral, a necessary condition is that it has to have this authoritative aspect to it. Then whatever it is you're talking about, or that's necessarily true, if it's lacking this trait of authoritativeness, it's not morality. Sorry. So this is going to be like another step that meta-ethicists take. This is like at the very beginning of the Poyman book too, by the way. The title responds to Mackey's title.
Yeah.
You got the 4 domains of ethical assessment, and then you got the traits and characteristics of moral claims before he gets into the schema of moral judgment. So this is ignored. He's harping on truth, and truth is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And there needs to be an extra argument from Emerson, for me anyway.
In this defining terms section?
From my theistic metaethics, and probably yours, for what he takes, what he needs these claims, what traits he needs these claims to have for them to be moral in the first place. Because we would argue that absent the authoritative trait, the authoritative characteristic, they probably be reduced to like prudential claims that are necessarily true or something, right?
Yeah, and I mean historically, when it comes to these objects,
how can you have prudential reasons if they're not authoritative reasons?
Humer, Willenberg, Schaefer-Landau, like just all the robust realists they think that they exist necessarily, right? But historically speaking, a lot of people have been conceptualists or modified theistic activists about these things, right? I mean, then those actually explained why they're necessary, right? So are they necessary in themselves, or are they necessary ab alio through something else? Right? So because there's 3 different kinds of modalities we can talk about here. There's some people say a fourth. I think they're nuts, so I won't go through the 4th one. So necessary or dependent, or necessary and dependent, right? So those are actually different 2 things. You can be necessary and dependent, you can be necessary or independent, or you can be not necessary and dependent. Those are the 3, right? And some people say not necessary and independent, which makes no sense. And so I see no reason to think that these things couldn't have an explanation for their existence if they actually exist, like as robust realists think. But let's say they didn't. let's just talk about truth instead of the actual propositions or any abstract objects at all, you still need to explain features of them. And someone like J.P. Moore would say, well, features are weasel words. Like, all right, fine, they exist. We need God for them anyway. But you still need to explain how in the world they're synthetic or authoritative, and they're not based on something that's neither of those things. Right?
Yeah,
or not either of those things. That wouldn't be authoritative, obviously. Right. So that's actually what I've titled. Like, I don't actually know if there's a title for it. I call it the problem of moral authority. Right?
Yes.
It's most of my work right now, and there's not very much work on it. And I want to pull it to the front here.
Mm-hmm.
We need an explanation for why normative oughts, especially moral oughts, have the intrinsic authority that they do.
You keep saying authority, authoritative, authority. What do you mean by that specifically? Stop just using that word, because authority to me means like they have power and they have some kind of legitimate power, because something can have power without authority. But I think in order to have authority, you probably need to have power. So, I mean, that's my quick little analysis of authority. Like, but typically it's used in a context like, just when I'm trying to reflect on how the word authority is used, I don't really understand how it could apply to a proposition. Like, unless you're talking about it's like inherently motivating or something.
Yeah, or overridingness.
Or overridingness. You can cash it on a few different ways. Some people actually would say intrinsic authority would just be, well, if they're intrinsic, then you don't need something beyond it. Or you can just say overridingness,
right?
Or just kind of be general and say moral authority. Right? So where does this moral authority from them come from? Does the universe just magically expect me to do certain things and not others? Like, how does that make sense? Yeah.
This is the difference.
I just magically expect you to do certain things and not others. No, I mean, I think that moral reasons are reasons, so like if you understand the moral reasons, then you understand why you have a reason to do something. Like, that something is wrong is itself a reason to not do it. Like I remember Schaefer Landau saying something like, well, maybe that something is treacherous is itself a reason to not do it. Like, if something is kind, that is a reason to do it. And to say like, well, you just magically expect me to, not punish the innocent. It's like, well, I think when you understand what that means, then you just have some kind of knowledge about like why you shouldn't do that. Anyway, that's not the clearest explanation I could have given there, but I'm just trying to figure out what they mean by authority. And I think that in this context, they mean something like, well, why should I care more about moral reasons as opposed to prudential reasons, or, my appetites or desires or something like that? Like, why would these sort of win out, these moral reasons, over other reasons? And I guess in our case, that seems more like a question of, do you not understand that moral reasons are supposed to be, like a moral reason is like a subcategory of reason. Like, once you understand them, you understand why you have a reason to do the thing in question. But like, why are they motivating? I mean, that seems like it's kind of woven into what he's saying a little bit. And the question of like, why should we be motivated to do what's good? I mean, in part, that's like a psychological question. It's a question about like what we have motives to do, but just making judgments about what it would be good to do or what we ought not do or something. That seems to me to be separable from the question of like, do I actually have like the willpower to do what I have the most reason to do?
Difference between claims about math and claims about the world. Now, the claims about the world are,
well, I mean, just this bears on that last point I was just making. Like, something like math doesn't seem authoritative in the sense that I've been trying to sort of guess what they mean by this. But I mean, mathematical truths are not normative. They're not like evaluative. And you can see how like normative or evaluative truths might be inherently motivating, but purely descriptive, non-evaluative, non-normative propositions, yeah, those don't seem authoritative in the sense that they involve some kind of motivation inherently, or I don't know, like, yeah, I mean, I guess I can kind of see if they're trying to say like, oh, well, one of these is authoritative and one of them isn't, then like, I feel like they must be talking about motivation on some level.
A little bit authoritative, because like isn't it true that we're appealing to authority because we haven't been to space or done the experiments ourselves or something? And it's a different kind of authority, though, than the authority that attaches to moral claims. But with math, it's just the truth is just axiomatic. It just flows from the axioms, and there's no like, who says? It's just what it is. It's the structure of mathematics is what it is.
Yeah. Okay. Now, just hold that thought in your mind for a second. Perhaps some of those mathematical truths, those axioms that, from which certain truths just flow, maybe they have companions. Maybe they have companions in guilt, one might say. There might be like similar propositions that we might consider that are kind of like that. I don't know, just a thought.
And clearly. Normative truths have a different nature than mathematical truths do.
Well, yeah, one of them
actually, I think
fucking descriptive, one of them's fucking non-descriptive. Oh my God, this is getting boring.
I actually think you do need God to explain mathematical truths, because I'm a causal paleontologist. I think literally logic is based on God. So I think it makes just as much sense. But I would say I think it makes a lot more.
I'm glad we got to that point because, it does kind of make sense if you're going to say that like moral propositions, like if you're going to believe in moral objectivity, then you have to believe in God to ground them. You might as well just go full bore and just be like, yeah, and also 2 + 2 would not equal 4 unless God stood in some relation to that proposition. Cool.
More sense in most people's minds to posit God as the foundation for morality because he explains all the features. Without God, I don't. Without God, I don't see how you can like explain most of the features, especially authority.
For sure.
As the kids say, a skill issue.
These propositions that supposedly exist, they have authority over me, moral authority. Exactly how does that work? Does it other people have authority? Is it my own standard?
Well, they don't have authority in the sense they're going to punish you if you don't listen to them, but it will never be right if you violate them. Like some people have an issue with calling things like a moral law because they're like, well, I can break a moral law, but I can't break like the laws of physics or something. It's like, yeah, but you can't. Here's what you can't do with the moral law. You can't torture a baby for fun and, grant it any moral status you like. You can't do something like that and say, it was good that I did that. That's the law that you can't violate. Because, what's the point of a law if you violate it? Then it's just some kind of human construction. So in this context, I'm saying that moral laws are kind of like mathematical laws. And it's like the objection that like, well, if I violate the moral law, then it doesn't have any, there's no authority. Like, why do how is it that I can break a law of nature, And it's like, well, look, you can do a bad thing, but it's bad objectively. There's no world in which it is good that you did that. Okay, like that's the law that you can't violate. It's like, well, how can there be a mathematical law? I can write on the whiteboard 2 + 2 = 5. Yes, you can write that on the whiteboard, but it won't be true. There's no possible world where it would be true that 2 + 2 = 5. You can say 2 + 2 = 5. You can write it on a whiteboard. There's no law of nature that's going to stop you from doing that, but it will never be true. And likewise, it will never be true that it's good to torture the innocent or that it's neither good nor bad to torture a baby or something. Yeah, so this does seem to me to be like mathematical laws, which look, if you just can't imagine how math could be objective without God, then you just need to increase your imaginative capacities. You need to just try a little harder.
Attitudes and desires have authority because those seem to be at my level and not above me, so I can flout them if I want to.
I can flout them if I want to. I can write 2 + 2 = 5 on a blackboard. No one will stop me.
See where the authority comes from at all. So these are definitely different kinds of truths. And we might get to this later, but there is also a difference between ethical and meta-ethical truths. They're not the same thing, right?
Oh, damn. It's another glaring oversight from me in this. I never distinguish between ethics and meta-ethics, except in the very next fucking section of this video, which is in the defining terms section. We have not even gotten to any argument yet, by the way. I think we've played a total of about 3 minutes of my 2-hour video, and we are almost 40 minutes into their video. And it's clear to me now that they are not going to play 95% of my video that they are responding to. This is a response video where they are not playing the video they're responding to.
And I think people put these lists of ethical truths out there. And then some of them are ethical, but some of them aren't. Some of them are meta-ethical truths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. And the meta-ethical truths don't necessarily have the authority problem because that attaches to first-order ethical claims. And maybe. But yeah, this overarching point we're making here is that just pointing out their necessity just isn't sufficient. And our argument is that if authoritativeness is a necessary feature of moral claims, then whatever it is that you're pointing out that is necessary aren't moral claims. Absent God, there's something else. They can be reduced or eliminated. in exchange for.
I said at the beginning of this video, which they didn't play this part, I said my main point is not to argue for secular moral realism. That is not the point of this video. I said it comes up a lot, but that's not the point. The point is to challenge the moral argument for God. But yeah, I mean, they're first of all, they're playing a section where I'm defining what moral objectivity means, and they're mad that I'm not sufficiently arguing for it. Once again, defining term section. Second of all, within the first 1 minute of this video, I said, the point of this video is not to argue for moral realism.
Claims or rational claims or something like that. So he says, he's talking about epistemology. I don't think they denied that. Yeah, how you know, and the truth, and the necessary truth, and all that stuff. But then he goes on to say, back in the walls, they did mention this briefly. I remember this. I don't know if this was the Good God book or the other one. But but what Chris is doing is he's going to draw this out. He's going to really unpack exactly why it consists of God's features and the way they are, and he's going to explicitly relate it to moral claims to make it a necessary feature for moral claims, such that if you don't have it, they're not moral claims. There's something else.
Yeah, and I've talked to those back in walls about this, and they agree with my characterization.
There you go.
So because without God, I don't see how any of that makes sense. Any of those.
All right. I agree. 2837 for the next one. Yes, 2837.
He just referenced Baggett and Walls, and I was like, that's not Jerry Walls, is it? And it was. I just had to check. Just a little story about Jerry Walls. Well, first of all, he wrote a book called The Logic of Damnation, where he argues for eternal conscious torment, so very stupid. But he's widely recognized as the best defender of eternal conscious torment. And I think he's debating Andrew Huranich at some point in the future. That'll be fun. Anyway, Jerry Walls declined to debate me about hell. He just didn't want to do it. There was a debate on capturing Christianity that was sort of starting to form between Jerry Walls and a guy named Josh Watson on Twitter, who I think is an atheist. Anyway, Josh is a good guy, but I think it was Josh, but he was talking about how ridiculous eternal conscious torment is, and he's a philosophy professor, and it sounds like Jerry Walls agreed to debate him, and Josh said, I don't really want to do that. And I think Cameron might have said, does anyone else want to do this? I can't remember exactly how this all went down, but I said, I would love to defend the idea that eternal conscious torment is incompatible with theism. And Cameron said, okay, well, let me just ask Jerry if he'd be down for that. And Jerry said he would not like to debate me. And I asked Cameron, do you mind telling me why? He said he didn't want to. And Cameron didn't reply. And I'm like, oh, that bad, huh? Which, to be fair, I mean, Jerry Walls is an accomplished academic. He's published many books. And, I'm just some atheist yapping away on YouTube. So, I can see why, as a general rule, you might not agree to do that kind of thing, especially if you just, at the time, I think I only had one video out about hell, and it was actually it was snarkier than this video even. There are some subjects that I think are just, they're worthy of ridicule.
Think of animals mistreating each other as sinning or something like this, or in the way that we think of that with human behavior. So the question is, why does morality suddenly start to change once you get to human beings? How do you account for that on atheism?
Now, I guess my difficulty is that I certainly agree that it's wrong to.
His voice is not annoying at all. It's melodious. It's like honey. It's honey dripping from his tongue.
Harm people, obviously, but it's hard.
I was aware of that when I'm like, because Gavin Ortland has a nice, deep pastoral voice, and then William Lane Craig is like right after that, and plus this audio for this video is horrible. So it sounds even worse than it usually does. That was not me trying to be snarky to Craig, but the contrast was vivid, and I was aware of that. But I'm just saying that was not the point. I was just playing two theists making this kind of argument. But man, poor Craig. Imagine having that voice your whole life. Meanwhile, Gavin Ortland has a very Chad style voice.
Hard for me to understand on a naturalistic worldview, such as I described, why on the worldview of naturalism, inflicting harm upon other members of our species is really wrong. It seems to me that this happens all the time among other animals. And so why is it wrong peculiarly for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right. Now, before I play this, I want to point out too is this is
Before I play the response to this from Shelley Kagan, let me just pause and talk for 18 minutes.
notoriously one of the debates where atheists are like, "Oh yeah, you for sure lost the one with Kagan." Yeah, he lost the one with Kagan for sure. This is like in the bag. This is even debatable.
He did.
I mean, why are you even
and by the way, most academically involved theists, what the fuck? Most analytic philosophers who are theists disagree with you about moral realism. And yeah, I mean, it's generally agreed this is one of the debates that Craig lost.
Why are you doubting me on this? He lost this one. He lost the Sean Carroll one, obviously.
Yep. All true.
Well, I disagree. Anyway, of course.
I don't care.
So these people are anti-Craig bots.
So
I'm not a fucking anti-Craig bot. I had a whole section about how he's a good philosopher, and it's a question I have to address. Why this, otherwise intelligent person is defending such a stupid argument.
Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong. Or 3-year-old, probably old enough, he has done something wrong. Like a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference?
Well, hang on. That depends whether God exists or not.
Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't.
MJ is shaking his head emphatically
between...
right now, as if this is the dumbest thing he's ever heard. That there are reasons to respect your property. That's what he's shaking his head at right now.
People that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's not wrong. If you or I would engage in that behavior...
Now MJ is shaking his head at the thought that lions can't reflect on their behavior, from which I can only conclude he's disagreeing with Kagan again, and he thinks lions can reflect on their behavior. They are moral agents. Noted.
Reflect upon that. We can recognize the reasons for not behaving that way. So I think the distinction is a fairly straightforward one, not a deep mystery or a hard challenge for the naturalist to respond to.
Okay. Do you want to go to the Craig's response?
It's up to you.
Just really quick, I just want to say one thing because
he doesn't have a response. He just changes the subject.
He did it again. He's doing the same thing. So he's saying that his moral psychology is sophisticated enough for him to recognize moral reasons, and this is what holds him morally responsible. This is once again a point about knowledge. We're making a point about grounding, right?
Yeah. I mean, I could.
Same thing. It was like what grounds these reasons that you're.
Okay, you have lost track of the conversation. Okay, so the question was, why is there a distinction between moral agents and moral patients if naturalism is true? And Kagan said, because some of us are capable of contemplating moral reasons and some of us are not. And he goes, you're failing to address the fucking moral argument for theism. Dude, you have fully lost track. Okay, so if anyone ever mentions moral epistemology, are you going to have this same kind of reaction? You realize there are contexts when it's appropriate to talk about moral epistemology, right? And like in this context, Craig said, why is there a difference between an adult human who is cognitively normal? Like why are we holding them morally responsible for their actions? And why don't we hold lions accountable? Like, dolphins forcibly copulate, but we don't say they're rapists, unless we're being kind of funny. Lions, kill antelope, but we don't say that they're murderers, so is there a distinction between human beings and lions? And Kagan says, well, yeah, obviously. There are these cognitive distinctions, and like that's why it's different. And it even works within the human species. We hold babies to different standards than we hold adults. People who are cognitively disabled, we hold to different standards. So that's the distinction. But we're just talking about the distinction between moral agents and moral patients. We're not talking about like the standard moral argument for God right now. We're just saying, hey, what's the criterion or criteria that distinguish mere moral patients and moral agents? That's the context. You just you called people bots earlier. It's like you're just not even aware of like the context that you find yourself in. Like we're talking about moral agents and moral patients, and you're like, once again, you're talking about moral epistemology. It's like, okay, that's a response that you have like programmed into you that is just randomly misfiring and like at points in the discussion where it makes absolutely no sense. This is like failing the Turing test. Like a level of fucking, you just don't know what's happening around you.
Your advanced moral psychology is able to grasp. Like what needs to be doing the work of grounding for those reasons to be moral reasons in the first place.
That wasn't the question. The question is, okay, here's the thing, dude. If you just calm down, you'd be in the same position as Kagan if I said, look, you were once a 1.5-year-old, and now you're whatever age you are, and we treat people, even the same person, differently at different stages of their life. Why is that? You are going to come back to their cognitive faculties. You're going to have to give the same kind of answer. This is not like a, theist versus atheist thing, even. This is just part of like normal moral practice. This is like built into the law. We hold minors to different standards than adults. This shouldn't even be like a contentious theism versus naturalism dispute.
Or have the traits of being moral reasons in the first place. It doesn't go deep enough. This is another epistemic point.
So I could rehash to something like, yes,
bringing up moral epistemology is fallacious.
Moral obligations apply to certain to entities that have a certain level of noetic or cognitive development, right? So if we start that way, and then I'm going to add to his scenario here. So yeah, I can appreciate rules for not ripping pages out of his book, or reasons for not ripping pages out of his book, but I can also appreciate reasons for doing it.
Like
right?
what?
I mean, I could be aware of good reasons to tear out the pages out of one or more of his books, and it's unclear why on atheism I wouldn't be justifying doing so. If, for example, turns out we both have this book. It's only 2 in the world. They're rare and they cost a lot of money, right? So you have one, I have the other one.
How about it's his property? I mean, that was the only scenario, but go ahead. The only feature of the scenario is just his. He said there are reasons for respecting other people's property, and we can appreciate those reasons. A toddler can't.
So if it turns out I did rip up your book, it would double the price of mine. That's number one. But then number two is I also have a very low probability of being caught. So why would it be wrong or irrational for me to do so?
No, you already expect it's wrong, and then you're just a bad person. You're just doing something that's immoral for prudential gain. I mean, that's all that's happening there. You can't just say, why is it wrong? It is wrong. And you're just saying, yeah, but why shouldn't I do wrong things? I mean, like, I'm just asking him to distinguish between those questions. You're saying, on the one hand, why is it wrong? But then on the other hand, it sounds like you're saying, okay, well, maybe it is wrong, but why can't I just do things that are wrong?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right. I mean, There's nothing about these moral reasons that Kagan is talking about that makes what you're specifying right now wrong. All it does is it motivates why he would think it was wrong if he caught you. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, what he thinks is wrong is independent of what we're saying grounds goodness and badness and wrongness and evil and all this stuff. It's another epistemic point.
Oh, silly me. I see. The reason you don't rip out people's pages is because God commanded us not to rip out people's pages of books they own. Oh, God damn it. I missed that.
Yeah. Right. Not correct to say is a good answer.
That's such a better answer. God commanded us not to rip out the pages of one another's books. It's not written anywhere, but he did say love your neighbor, and obviously that just follows. So yeah, and like, why should we obey God's commands? Well, because he's God. So there you go. That's such a better answer than saying there are reasons to respect others' property.
Comes to difference in morality between, or how morality could apply to us and not animals, but not why it applies to us at all.
Yes.
Right. So
right.
I mean, and I think that's what the point is in bringing that point, like that point up that Greg does. That's the point of it.
He's about to say it's necessary but not sufficient, and Kagan's like, well, that's what you asked me initially, so I guess we can keep playing it.
Oh, well, I answered your question, but now you're asking a different question. Wow, fucking moron, right? The fact that he answered the question he was asked and not a different question.
Let's see where it goes.
It's up to you.
That's something else.
I think that's a good answer for why we wouldn't regard animals as moral agents who would be culpable for their acts. But it seems to me that at best
that's not what those two just said.
Would go to show that rationality, or the ability to reflect rationally on things, is a necessary condition for moral behavior. But I don't see that that's a sufficient condition for moral behavior. It's still not clear to me why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay.
Yeah, see, so now he's asking the question that they were just asking. You know, the deeper question about how do you ground like moral truths? You know, but that was not the first question. The first question was, how can you, as an atheist, distinguish between moral agents and moral patients? And he's like, okay, so that's how you distinguish. But for moral agents, how do you ground these moral truths? Okay, well, that's a completely different question.
So the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us. And you've just...
No, see, he's wrong. He doesn't know what necessary and sufficient conditions are. He needs to give a sufficient condition for it to be all it takes.
Yeah, right.
If all you give is a necessary condition, you need to give me some more stuff. That's wrong what Kagan just said. I know he's a really good talker. I got it. It's a very good talker. It flows. But he didn't do what Craig asked him to do. Period.
He said, why is it wrong, curiously, for humans to do these things, but not for lions? And Kagan said, well, in order to answer that, I just need to point out a relevant difference between me and a lion. And then he did that. And Craig said, I think that's a good answer to what to the question I asked. But how do you ground moral truths? So once again, you're just not following the conversation. Sorry if it's too hard for you.
I mean, at this point...
Well, don't worry. Don't worry. I'm not going to do what you all think I'm going to do, which is just flip out.
Getting so annoyed right now.
I guess a good clip. Funny.
I think said, yeah, all right. So I managed to do that.
The distinction between...
Oh, do you want me to get his?
No, that's all I had for that one.
Okay. Well, sorry, Emerson, if
they're not even going to play what I said about This is the best response video ever. Well, geez, you didn't need me for that. You just played a clip of Craig and Shelley Kagan and didn't even play what I said about it.
I wish I could just type it in. 3205. Is that good enough?
Sure.
Hitting a baseball with a baseball bat is morally neutral. Hitting a dog with a baseball bat is not. Does that fact really come down to God's commands? Or is there something about... Because God commanded us. That's why. Hang on. Let's just replay... This is why this video is so fucking frustrating. Hitting a baseball with a baseball bat is morally neutral. Hitting a dog with a baseball bat is not. I said 2 sentences, and he blurts out, why? Well, the explanation's coming, dipshit. Shut up for a second. Does that fact really come down to God's commands? Or is there something about the dog that is notably different from the baseball? Anyone can see there's a difference between animal... Okay, so my claim is there's a difference between dogs and baseballs, and that these features of a dog versus the features of a baseball are morally relevant. Okay, so that's the part they've got a big objection to. Oh my God, I can't believe they played like 15 whole seconds. Okay, so dogs and baseballs, different. Are they different? Are they the same? Is it morally irrelevant that one of them is conscious and can feel pain and the other one isn't? Let's find out.
Necessary. It's a necessary condition for the dog to be different from the baseball, but is that sufficient?
Yeah, well, so it's unclear what he's referring to here because it seems to be kind of like waffling between rights and value, and they're not the same thing.
Holy fuck.
Moral obligations are rights, or apply to rights, and value...
All I said is one of them is a moral patient and the other one isn't. That's all I said.
Is about the intrinsic properties of the thing. Unless you think extrinsic value is what we're talking about here, which he does get into later. He thinks divine command theorists or either they are, or they should admit that they're talking about extrinsic value. And it's the same error that Willenberg had in his book Robust Ethics. But we'll get to that. But yes,
the same error that Willenberg had. Remember the Terence Cuneo thing where he's just like, the worst part of this book is that he's attacking a stupid view that no one has. You really can't make anyone happy, can you?
Does the value of a dog really come down to God's command, or is there something about the dog itself? No and yes. Right. Yeah, it doesn't come down to God's commands because God's commands isn't what gives value to entities.
Oh, it's God's nature. Right. We have to stand in a certain relation to God's nature, not his commands. Oh God, that is so fucking different. Forget everything anyone ever said about the Euthyphro dilemma because that is different. Anyway, yeah, it's the intrinsic features of the dog. Like God could not have commanded the reverse. Like that's the whole fucking point, and anyone can see this. That like God could not have commanded, okay, it's morally neutral to hit a dog with a baseball bat, but it's morally bad to hit a baseball with a baseball bat. He couldn't have done that. Why? Because of the intrinsic features of the dog and the baseball. There are morally relevant differences between these things, and it doesn't come down to the relation they stand in to God's nature. That is obvious. Anyone should be able to see that.
Like that, and that's not what theists say. Right now, your obligation to not hit a dog with a bat. Yes, that comes down to God's commands. Right, and part of the explanation would be that yes,
Can I hit a cow with a bat if I'm gonna eat it later?
the dog has intrinsic properties that make it valuable.
Be a good
Right.
steward of his creation, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can cash that out in various number of ways, and divine command theorists have. Like some people say, yeah,
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say these guys are not vegans. They could be. So if they are, I apologize. But you guys are both horrible stewards of God's creation. And it's just so rich to hear you talk about how, oh, well, God commanded us not to hit dogs with baseball bats. First of all, no, he didn't. I mean, unless you're just like wildly extrapolating from other things that are in the Bible or something. No, we have a moral intuition that we shouldn't like cause harm like that. You know, we see it happening. We're like, that's wrong, you know? And yes, Michael, that is an epistemic judgment right there. It's not a fallacy to do that. Anyway, and then when I reflect upon, hey, what grounds the truth of this, I say, oh, well, you know what? It seems to come down to like the features of the dog itself and like the features of the act. Like, I don't think I can just change the extrinsic scenario where like God exists or God doesn't exist or something, and suddenly the status of me hitting a dog with a baseball bat changes. But you change the animal to a cow or a pig or a chicken, and now you can do anything to it. You can just create industrial factories of torture, and these people will, you know, mock you for saying, oh, that seems bad. It's just annoying to me when they're just like, well, God commands us to be good stewards and to not hit dogs with baseball bats. You're doing a pretty piss poor job of being a good steward of the animals when you are, you know, actively supporting factory farms and calling everyone a pussy who like questions it.
Because the dog's part of God's creation, has the property being created by God, or you know, you could say he's the dog in the sense that it's sentient is partially in the image of God or something like that.
Oh yeah. That makes a ton of fucking sense. It doesn't have to do with it suffering. It's because it's partially in the image of God. Fucking asshole.
So you can spell it in whatever way. So yes, the dog
Shit is so stupid, man. I'm sorry. I'm at the end of my fucking rope already. Like we're about halfway through this video, and it's just like this is just testing my patience. They're barely playing any of the video. I've played more of their video. I've played 49 minutes of this video, and they've played less than 5 of my 2-hour video. And I put a hell of a lot more thought into that video than they put into this one. I've let them have the floor a lot more than they've let me have the floor.
Solely in virtue of extrinsic properties. And it's wrong to hit the dog because God commands it. Commands that it's wrong.
Where?
He commands not to hit the dog.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's really
That's
not,
for me.
not that complicated on that one. So, I heard that. What was that?
That's the next timestamp. The weight of my finger hit the play button.
So I mean, yeah, there's really a lot to say about that. Like God's command, the divine command theory is a metaphysical theory about moral obligations, right? Specifically.
All this is in response to me saying that there's a distinction between moral patience and non-moral patience. For example, baseballs and dogs. It's like they literally are just, I might as well have not said anything. They could have just not played any part of the video and just talked about me, you know?
Specifically. Right, so he's talking about moral obligations. And it's true, though, that moral value and obligations are two sides of the same coin. I don't think you can have one without the other.
Yeah,
right? If something morally valuable has intrinsic moral value, it has rights, and you have obligations to obey those rights. C. Stephen Evans has this. His moral theory is kind of a conglomeration of talking about moral obligations as divine command. So divine command theory, natural law theory for value, and then for character, virtue ethics. So he combines all of them, and I like that. So actually, if you were to want to know my kind of almost, not my entire view, but a lot of my view on morality, that's that would be the same thing as
Thanks, I hate it.
Evans.
Okay. Alrighty. I don't have much to add to that other than what I said before. I mean, it just seems like every single time we're asking about like ontological reasons, we get these necessary conditions that are epistemic and not ontological.
Okay, that is literal gibberish. I'm not even going to analyze that. We get necessary epistemic conditions every time we ask about blah, blah, blah. First of all, you're playing clips from like a defining terms section and now a section on the distinction between moral agents and moral patients. You just keep blurting out moral epistemology versus ontology. Like, dude, this is like as bad as the atheists who just like robotically yell out fallacies when you're trying to get them to think about something.
And even if there is an eventual ontological ground that's related to obligations, it just looks like Emerson Green's just kind of focusing on the non-ontological.
How would you even know what I think anyway? You've played fucking 4 minutes of this video.
The obligations with the dog and the rock.
Yeah,
He
I
talks
didn't say
about
anything about
premise.
obligations.
he seems to go back and forth.
Okay.
I didn't go back and forth between anything. I never brought up obligation. And how would you remember anyway? How would you know what I said?
Sometimes I hear epistemological points, and sometimes I hear metaphysical points.
Yeah, sometimes I'm talking about metaphysics and sometimes I'm talking about epistemology. Crazy. Is that all right with you guys if I sometimes talk about epistemology and sometimes talk about metaphysics? Is that cool with you?
And it's not wrong. It's just sometimes I think you put them a little too close together, where one doesn't entail the other or something. It's just it can just be kind of weird. And by the way, if anybody's listening, I don't know how loud I sound on YouTube. I'll watch this video back.
You sound
I
great.
kind of talk fast, and I don't talk really loud, especially because right now I'm at work.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but if I'm too quiet, let me know.
No. You sound good to me. All right. Tell me when you want me to stop, or I'll stop too if I see something.
I'm going for it. That person's.
He's going for it.
I know, but why is that stupid closed captioning on?
I think it might be on his video. I don't know.
Oh, it is?
On my video.
It's irrational. And we can explain that
I have the closed captioning on in the screen recording that I posted.
by saying there's a rule of rationality that says self-mutilation pursued for its own sake is irrational. I think that rule is true.
See, I like how they're just playing a clip of Russ Schaefer Landau. They played a clip of Gavin Ortland, William Lane Craig, and Shelley Kagan, and now they're playing a clip of Russ Schaefer Landau. I mean, like, I think there's like as much William Lane Craig in this video as there is me. Like, it's just so funny that like from my video, I had like maybe 5 clips total in that video, and I think they're gonna play every single one and respond to that. I mean, fine. I mean, Russ Schaefer Landau's better on this than I am, obviously, but like, still, it's just funny that it's a response video to me, and they're just playing like the only parts where I'm not talking.
That's not the fundamental rule of rationality, but it is a rule of rationality, I think. I think it's true, and I don't think that anyone made it up. There are rules in epistemology, the study of the theory of knowledge. One such rule says this.
They also just introduce this. There's no context here. Like, what are you talking about, Russ? Why are you saying all this? He's talking about how there can be laws without a lawgiver, for the record. And he's like, well, there are mathematical laws of logic, epistemological rules, and so on. So if there can be those, why can't there be moral laws?
If you have a belief on the basis of no evidence and in the face of all contrary evidence, then your belief is unjustified. I think that's a true principle, a true rule about the justification of beliefs. I don't think anybody made it up.
That's
So what I've
the
done is
epistemology fallacy. You just mentioned epistemology.
tried to give you examples in which it's at least superficially plausible.
So I can't remember who this is. Was this Schaefer Landau?
It sounds like him, but I'd have to go back.
Okay. Well, if it is,
I introduced the
Again,
clip and
he's a
said, here's Russ Schaefer Landau. Yeah, they really did their homework on this.
that's realist, and he
Right.
knows very well that these things on divine command theory were not made up. Right? They're like laws of logic, moral truths, especially.
Yeah, it's really funny how when you just take things out of context and then just assume they're in a certain context, that what he's saying is stupid. He's like, he knows very well that divine rules were not just made up. It's like he's fucking talking about how moral realism is possible, like how you could have rules without a rule giver. That is the point of this. He's saying there are mathematical laws, but there's no mathematical lawgiver. And then you're assuming he's saying this in a different context because you're just playing 10-second fucking clips completely out of context. So understandably, you don't know what's happening.
He knows very well that these things on divine command theory were not made up. Right? They're like laws of logic, moral truths, especially about value. They weren't made up. They've always been that way. Right now, they have a ground for their existence. That's the difference. Right? Like, I don't think people. I don't know of any theists that think that these were just made. Now, there is a constructive element to
Right. I was
obligations.
supposed to ask you about left out. Does he come up with what's possible and necessary?
Well, and it's not just, well, yeah, he did, but as a theory, like those things are always that way and they can't be otherwise, right? And that's because they're based on God, like in his power and the knowledge of his own power, his nature. And that doesn't change. So in every world, they're the same. They don't just get made up. right? Like laws of logic. They don't just on theism, on divine command.
You are
They don't
completely fucking misunderstanding the point because you're playing 10-second clips out of context and talking about them for 30 minutes. God damn, this is so stupid.
just get made up. They're just as necessary. Actually, just as necessary. I say that. By that I mean they exist in every possible world. In a very similar way. I don't say the same way because they seem to think that laws of logic, as like propositional, as if they're necessary a se, and I don't. I think they're necessary a valio. That's a difference, but they're still both necessary.
Right.
So I think the same thing of all those, including a lot of mathematical, rational, etc., moral, meta-ethical truths are the exact same way. Now I'm a more internalist, so I take obligations a bit differently. Although most philosophers, if we're going to believe, again, Phil papers, if we're to actually like the Phil papers, most philosophers are internalists. So, in other words, that moral obligations only apply to a certain level of noetic development in a person, right? And of course, that bars certain developmental issues like psychopathy, right?
We'll get into that.
Yeah. So,
but once again, I moved on. Whoever was talking, if it was Schaefer-Landau, once again, there's just this emphasis put on it's truth. It's necessary truth. That's it. That's all they think moral claims consist of.
Okay, so what he just said about moral internalism is a little confusing to me because he said that he's a moral internalist, and then he said, by that I mean, and then he said something I've never heard of. So maybe there's some other moral internalism debate that I'm not thinking of right now. But moral internalism, I thought, had to do with like moral motivation and having to do with once you grasp the reasons, the moral reasons, then there's some connection there to moral motivation. Like once you grasp a moral reason, then you see that it is like a reason to do a certain action or not, or refrain from a certain action, Yeah, I mean, that's in conflict with if he is a moral internalist in that sense, where it's like there's some kind of intimate connection between like understanding moral reasons and having moral motivation and all that. This is a very rough outline, by the way. But if he says that, then that's in conflict with some of the authoritative comments he was making earlier about like, well, why would moral reasons be motivating? Like, why would they have authority? It's like, well, if you're a moral internalist, then you're on my side about that. That's pretty confusing how he can affirm moral internalism and then say, well, just because I grasp the moral reasons, like, why would I judge that that's what I should do and that, and have motivation to do it instead of like my prudential concern, of making more money or something like that. I mean, the moral internalism stuff, like, I don't really want to fly off on this just from memory, but it's also why I don't think an evil God is like ideally conceivable, because if he's omniscient, then he knows all the moral facts, and if moral internalism is true, then I think he would be motivated to do the good and not evil. Yeah, anyway, that's laid out in a longer argument in a paper somewhere, but anyway.
They're being necessarily true.
Yeah.
And they're just not addressing what the ground needs to do to make these moral claims in the first place. And saying about overriding this and authoritative, it's just not discussed in this video so far. So
yeah.
That's annoying. I mean, first of all, I said I wasn't defending moral realism, like that wasn't the point of the video. Second of all, I do kind of touch on this many, many times, and you just weren't listening or didn't understand. You are barely playing the video. So saying that like, oh, you just doesn't know about this, it's just extremely fucking annoying.
Sailing past each other in the night, you have to like address this.
I talk about moral grounding multiple places explicitly, by the way.
Okay, this prescriptivity thing is okay, that's fine. But overriding this, we need to discuss this. This is in philosophical foundations too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very implausible to me that these are not indispensable features of moral claims. This authoritative thing. It's probably the most important thing.
Yeah, I think so.
It's probably a sufficient condition, honestly, because of the nature of the authority. It makes it, because of who the authority is, the necessary stuff kind of falls out, and everything else kind of falls out after that.
Yeah, and I've said this before, it really seems to me that if you're not a theist, what you tend to do, I think, is, and people do this on purpose, like it just happens to be that people basically take all of God's attributes or non-mereological parts and then separate them out and then use those to explain fundamental features of reality that they couldn't explain otherwise, right? So that's what they do with like propositions, which I think are thoughts, if they exist, and that's what they do with possibilities. Like you need a foundation for possibilities as well. Like they don't just kind of exist out there in the ether. which is what I like to say. Just all these different features, right, of reality that just they're not just brute. And brute explanations, you really only should be doing theoretically, like as a theoretical virtue, you really should only be pulling out bruteness if there either is no explanation, and sometimes you still shouldn't, but if in principle there can be no explanation, right, then yeah, sure, go ahead. But they're very, very few, and I don't know if I can think of any cases where we actually have to do that, right? So, yeah, and I mean, like,
how about we ought to obey God's commands? Is that just a brute fact? Because you're saying these things are grounded in God's commands or God's nature, right? Like, oh, well, it all comes down to God's nature. And it's like, well, okay, but you're saying that I have all these obligations, for instance, and Craig says this too. You have obligation, like the obligations you have are grounded in God's commands. Like, so the modified divine command theorists ground things in God's nature, not his commands. But Craig, at least, has written that okay, yeah, the moral obligations are grounded in God's commands. And it's like, okay, but why are you obligated to follow God's commands? Like the chain of explanation is going to end at some point. So if by bruteness you just mean explanatory termination, then that is going to happen at some point, whether you're a theist or an atheist. And I think it makes sense to do that, if explanation is going to come to an end, then it should be at pretty axiomatic feeling places, like A equals A, certain things that just seem true and there's no defeater for them. Like that whole category of like proper basicality. Like, I think that there's something to that. A long time ago, before I was really even into epistemology, Ozymandias Ramses II came on the pod, and he described, the features of properly basic beliefs. And I remember one of them was like, you would basically be indistinguishable from an insane person if you didn't accept them, like rejecting induction or something like that. Yeah, there are some things that are basic. There are some things that are, there's nothing justifying them further. They're just the place where explanation comes to an end. And if you're saying I'm obligated to obey God's commands, that seems like kind of a brute fact. It doesn't seem like there's anything underneath that. Again, if by brute you just mean explanatory termination. I mean, that's the place where the sidewalk ends, right? Like, I have to obey God. One ought to obey God. I have a whole section of the video dedicated to this. Might be interesting to talk about. Not that you fuckers are going to talk about it, but in any detail. And if you do, you'll play 8 seconds of it, and then that'll be the end of that.
The thing I say all the time is that if God doesn't exist, I don't care about morality.
All right, so you're a horrible, evil person. Noted. If God doesn't exist, I'm going to rape and murder people. Interesting.
I would stop with ethics. I'll stop with ethics. It's not interesting anymore because none of the features can have any ground for them at all. I don't see why I should believe any of the moral dictates of reality, of non-conscious reality. I don't see, and if you look at even Schaeffer.
How can you say all this shit about being good without God and everything, and then turn around and say that?
Now calls moral obligations directives. Directives? That's interesting phraseology.
And even in the deontic logic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, deontic logic. Like, if you look how deontic logic is structured, it is permissible that. It's impermissible that. Right? You look at the logic structure there and the way it's cashed out.
Forbidden is in there.
Forbidden's in there. Forbidden. Yep. Really? This is
really.
By the way, just earlier comment he made about how he just never discusses grounding. He doesn't answer the grounding. Anyway, I just hit Control F on my Google Doc, and ground comes up 40 times. And okay, so I mentioned the word ground 40 times. And that's just my words. If it's brought up in clips, which I'm pretty sure I played a long clip of Joe Schmid discussing a paper about morality maybe not needing a ground. So, I mean, there's probably another 40 mentions just in that clip. So anyway, conservatively, there are like 50 or 60 mentions of moral grounding in the video. Okay? And he says I just don't mention it. So fuck you.
Very weird language.
It's almost like these apologists were onto something. I don't know. I like their intuition so far.
Yeah. So But I mean, this isn't so strange. Like David Enoch says the exact same thing about abstract objects. He says if they don't exist, he no longer cares about morality. He could be an error theorist or he'd be non-cognitivist, and I completely agree. But I just put it to God instead. So take them away, and then So there's a lot of views on Schaeffer and Dow. I think we went over a good number of them, so I won't rehash them here. But if you want to, you can go back look at those videos.
All right, next timestamp.
One problem for divine command theory has persisted in various forms for about 2,500 years since Plato first raised it in his Euthyphro dialogue. Either God has reasons for issuing his commands, or he does not have reasons. If he has a reason for forbidding torture, say because of the intrinsic features of the act, then at least some moral truths are independent of God. Thus, the moral argument fails. If human beings are intrinsically valuable, that is, valuable in and of themselves, ends in themselves, then God is superfluous here. God is not required to give human beings moral worth. Maybe God could give additional value to human life, but that's all he could do. Maybe human life is not intrinsically valuable, but only valuable in virtue of something else. For example, in virtue of some fact about God. This seems to be the implicit view of many theists, whether they admit to it or not. As I said in the opening, there's an easy solution to...
So we'll get to Euthyphro dilemma after this. So he says maybe human life is not intrinsically valuable, but only valuable in virtue of something else. For example, in virtue of some fact about God. So, and again, he says it seems to be the implicit view of the theists, whether they admit it or not. So he adds that last part. Of course, they're not going to admit that because no theist actually thinks this, right? Like,
you think this. This is your view. This is the fucking divine command theorist view, dipshit, that human beings are not intrinsically valuable, but only valuable because God gives them value. If there is no God, then humans have no value. Fuck you.
That I don't know of any academic philosopher who is a theist who says that there are things.
I really want you to hold it in your mind that he's saying this is not a view that any theists accept. Because I guarantee you he is about to exactly subvert what he just said. He says that if God didn't exist, he wouldn't even care about morality. That there would be no objective morality. That what I'm saying is things can have intrinsic value or disvalue. That's kind of how I'm grounding. If we're even going to talk about grounding, which I typically don't frame things in that way when I'm just discussing my own views. But if I'm talking about the intrinsic features of the act, if you're asking for like some kind of truth maker of these moral propositions, there's a whole tangent here about moral propositions and like whether they are sort of summarized. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that right now. Anyway, just hold it in your head that no theist believes that human life is not intrinsically valuable, but only value in virtue of some fact about God, his commands, or his nature, or some such. No theist thinks that. Every theist believes human life is intrinsically valuable. In other words, valuable regardless of whether or not God exists. Every theist thinks that.
That we're not intrinsically valuable, even on a standard definition, right? Each and every person, for example, is intrinsically valuable solely in virtue of its properties or its intrinsic properties. That's correct, right? But that doesn't mean you can't go on to explain the intrinsic moral value of things. Willenberg, realist realists do this just as much. They say the exact same thing, except where they put propositions or abstract objects, I put God. That really is the difference. Like Willenberg actually brings this point up.
Okay, so that tangent I was trying not to go on actually is worth going on, where you talk about these moral propositions and you say, okay, those are the things, so there's this extrinsic relation. Human beings stand, in this extrinsic relation to these moral propositions, and that's what gives them value. And it's like, no, the propositions are like descriptions of states of affairs. They're ways the world could be. They're things that are the case, and I'm thinking that like, in the same way, there's this proposition like it is generally lighter in the day than it is at night. Or like putting your hand in a fire hurts, or dogs exist. It's like there is something that like makes that true. And it's like a dog is what makes the proposition dogs exist true. And in the same way, it's like the intrinsic features of the act that make the propositions true, I think. And I believe this is Schaeffer-Landau's view, but anyway, I'm not doing a good job summarizing it, but there's a reason I'm constantly harping on the intrinsic features of the act and the intrinsic features of people. And intrinsic is to be contrasted with extrinsic, Like if you're talking extrinsic, then you're talking relations between things. And if you're talking intrinsic, then like the buck stops there, And over and over and over again, you're saying the buck does not stop where I'm saying it stops. You're saying we need a deeper explanation, and that explanation has to be God.
Where he says that something very similar, right? But he does the same thing, right? He gives the exact same definition, and then he says, well, the way that we explain this is that there are these abstract objects that these beings instantiate. Okay, right. And he also says these objects are essential for his view. Okay, that means you're using something else external to the agent to explain its intrinsic value, right? We do the same thing. That doesn't make it extrinsically valuable. That's not what we're talking about.
Okay, here's a
right?
question. So, if the thing that you're talking about, aka God, didn't exist, but human life still existed, would human life be valuable? And your answer, because you're some type of divine command theorist, is no.
It is intrinsically valuable, and we explain that by reference.
It's intrinsically valuable, but if the world were different, it wouldn't have any value. I know what these words mean that I'm using.
Right. I don't think anybody thinks that. Because in order to say, because they're kind of exclusive here, you kind of have to say, we don't say that, oh, they have intrinsic properties, but they're not valuable because of those. They're only valuable because they relate to God in some way. No, that's not what we say. Now, again, there might be someone who says this.
Is this what gaslighting is?
That says that. So if you just go up and ask a theist, you think that there are intrinsically valuable things, especially their academic theists, will say, yeah, I definitely do, according to the standard definition. Right?
Yeah, I agree that people use the word intrinsic value, but what I'm saying is they don't recognize, well, first of all, a lot of those academic theists you're talking about are not divine command theorists. But the ones who are, if you're saying, I believe such and such an act, like, torturing a baby is intrinsically wrong, but only if God exists, that is incoherent.
So, that's really all there is to that one.
That you're confused?
Yeah, I follow what you're saying there. Do you also see like a problem with the way he set up this argument? I've never seen it formulated in terms of reasons.
Reasons, yeah.
A new way of formulating it?
Yeah, there's a lot of different modifications that people make to it, right? So, and this one is just, it's another one. That God has reasons or he doesn't. And his point is that if he doesn't have reasons, then his will is arbitrary or his commands are arbitrary. But if he does, then he must have those reasons must be referencing something external to him. Neither of which to really argue for, I don't think. Or at least I didn't see much of an.
None of which are arguing. What do you think is going on in the other 2 hours of this video that you're not watching?
Argument in here about that. There's no, for example, I see no reason to think that God can't have more reasons for doing A, B, or C, or commanding certain things or not commanding other things in reference to his own nature. Why is that not a decent explanation? He does bring this up later about referring to God's nature. Like, oh, okay, but we can still ask why God's nature is that way. Like, yes, we can, and it's because it couldn't be otherwise, and that is an explanation. It literally could not be otherwise. It's impossible.
Earlier you said just saying something necessary is not like, it doesn't mean there's nothing else to say. I don't know, just saying God is necessary. I mean, first of all, this is a horrible summary of what I had to say, but about the no theist thinks this, yada, yada. And by the way, MJ being very quiet right now, because I bet you he's thinking, well, hang on, I think that. Hang on, let's just see how this plays out, actually, because I want to come back to the intrinsic value point, but I just want to see if MJ is brave enough to say, I would say that human beings don't have value if God doesn't exist, which is something Chris also thinks, and William Lane Craig thinks, and every divine command theorist thinks. But yeah, let's see if they cop to that or not.
Possible. And we give the similar explanations for mathematical truths, like why does 2 plus 2 not equal 5? It can't be otherwise, and that is a legitimate explanation.
But we also have to say not only
torturing the innocent is wrong. It couldn't be otherwise.
Can it not be otherwise? But it doesn't depend on anything either.
Right. There's nothing external that I was depending on here.
Right. Every view in metaethics has this position. So moral realists are going to have something that you can't go above, right? Whatever natural or non-natural properties, and you can just ask that question again about that, and they have to say something along the same lines there.
What?
Yeah, and here's the weird thing too. Try to apply the same thing to like propositions. Either they have reasons or they don't. Well, of course they don't. They're not conscious, right? So it's kind of another thing. Explain their intent.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a better answer than your stupid fucking answer, grounding it in 3 subjects. Oh, well, the explanation ends with 3 subjects and their nature, which couldn't be otherwise. Okay, and then as opposed to just ending it like with a proposition or with the intrinsic features of the act or something. Yeah, and they're like, well, that's different. It's like, yeah, it is different. It makes a lot more sense.
And explain their intentionality of propositions. Given that they can't have
propositions don't have intentionality, dipshit. Why do you keep saying that?
reasons, like there's no consciousness, there is unconscious, uncaring reality somehow preferring that I do certain things and preferring I do not other things, not do other things. So,
do you not know what a proposition is or what intentionality is?
Yeah, obligations are referred to in a lot of different ways that really harken back to God, like instructions and directives and
when you make the ground a
posts, etc. Yeah.
When you make the ground a person, everything just falls into place. Nothing's mysterious anymore. It's like, oh, there's a person at the bottom of all this stuff. Okay, that makes sense.
No. Oh, what? Unitarian exposed. He said there's a person at the bottom of all this. No, MJ, there are 3 persons at the bottom of all this, which makes equal sense. Anyway, so they did not cop to it, but I mean, do I even need to like play like clips of them saying that things don't have value or whatever? I mean, like I don't even know how Chris could say that. No theist thinks that human beings are not intrinsically valuable. I mean, I guess maybe what he's thinking is like theists would say those words, but what I'm saying is this is the claim that I'm making, that if it's intrinsically valuable, it's not invaluable. It's not valuable in virtue of something else like God. Meaning if God didn't exist, then human beings would still be valuable. And that is the thing I'm saying theists disagree with. But what I'm saying is if you think that human beings are only valuable if God exists, that is what ontologically grounds the value of human beings or something, then what I'm saying is that is not what intrinsic value means. Like if you are talking about extrinsic value because it's valuable in virtue of something else, not in virtue of itself or something, not just in itself, So this is from Alex Malpass. I did not have permission to share this, but I don't think it's like private or anything. Alex Malpass DM'd me after my video came out and said, he's like, oh, this struck me that, you said this explicitly in the video, but anyone who picks the, it's good because God says it or something about God's nature, something, is thereby committed to there being nothing intrinsically wrong with anything, including the sorts of torture that Russ mentions. That's a consequence of the view. So you could ask Frank Turek or whoever, is there anything wrong with intrinsically torturing a baby merely for fun? And unless they admit it, you have them trapped. And I said, yeah, that's perfect. That's finally a way to use the apologists' tortured baby against them. But yeah, if you present it as kind of a dilemma. So like either there's something intrinsically wrong with torturing a baby or there isn't. If there is, then say goodbye to God's contribution to why it's wrong. Or no, if it is intrinsically wrong, then, say goodbye to God's contribution. And if there isn't anything, then really you think there's nothing intrinsically wrong with torturing a baby, you monster? That's basically what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say like, look, either this kind of stuff is intrinsically wrong, punishing the innocent or torturing a baby for fun. Like at some point, the moral explanation is going to come to an end. And I'm saying it's with the intrinsic features of the act. It's, with the like properties of human beings or something. So what I'm saying is I think it is intrinsically wrong to perform some of these acts, but they say it's not intrinsically wrong. It's only wrong if God exists. Okay. So there's one totally non-controversial claim I'm making, which is like, my view is the following. The moral realist view is that this such and such an act is objectively right or objectively wrong. It's a necessary truth, and like, I really think that this point about the intrinsic features of the act is really important in the explanation. But anyway, so, you say that, and then you say, well, hang on, you're a divine command theorist or a modified divine command theorist. You don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with torturing a baby because it quite literally depends upon the existence or non-existence of this being, these 3 persons, If these 3 persons don't exist, then there's nothing right or wrong. So you don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with torturing a baby. So the more controversial claim I'm making, which I only say controversial because I haven't heard it made very often, it just comes down to this tension between saying that something is intrinsically wrong and saying that something is wrong in virtue of God's nature. I'm saying that both of those cannot be right. And I'm aware that theists will say that certain acts are intrinsically wrong. There's even a very confusing argument I heard once during that Capturing Christianity, 1 million arguments for God or whatever, where it was like certain acts are intrinsically wrong. if certain acts are intrinsically wrong, then God makes them wrong. It's like, how are you using that word intrinsically? You know, how are you distinguishing it from extrinsic, right? Like, I mean, at a base level, intrinsic means in itself, and extrinsic means not that, you know, it means in virtue of something else. You're saying these things are wrong in and of themselves. If they're wrong in and of themselves, then there's another thing that makes them wrong. Like what? Then again, I don't know how you're using these words if you're saying that. So to be fair to Chris, theists will use that word intrinsically wrong or intrinsically valuable or what have you. And the more controversial claim I'm saying is that there is a tension between claims like that such and such is intrinsically wrong or humans are intrinsically valuable or what have you. There's a tension between that and divine command theory. And he just doesn't grapple with that at all. He just says, well, theists will use these words. And I'm like, yeah, and I just made an argument that's a confused position. And you said literally nothing to undermine it.
Yeah. So I don't think it's and I really don't think it's a problem if God has more reasons for things, like, or has reasons. In fact, I don't think it's and I really don't think it's a problem if God has more reasons for things, like, or has reasons. In fact,
it means there's a deeper fucking explanation of why he gave his commands or why his nature is the way it is. Seems like a problem for divine command theory to me.
I think that makes it stronger. I think that makes morality much stronger because then morality has a purpose.
I agree. If there are like objective moral reasons, it does make it stronger. Glad we finally agree about something.
This guy has actually reasons for commanding certain people to do things and commanding to do not things or not other things. But on atheism, what's the purpose of morality? Purpose comes from without, right?
Dude, this is the whole point of my opening thought experiment, where God is like thinking about punishing the innocent, and he's thinking about acts of rape and torture and so on. And I'm saying he's thinking about those acts hypothetically in this made up thought experiment scenario. Okay, guys, calm down. He's thinking about those acts. And I'm saying when he understands the features of those acts, I'm saying that he does not have the freedom to say, and it's good to torture a baby. I just decided. Again, don't get too hung up on the fucking irrelevant details of the thought experiment. But what I'm saying is, like, there are obvious moral reasons that a creator would grasp for the same reason. It's like, you know, he just grasps that 2 and 2 equal 4. He doesn't decide that 2 and 2 equal 4. 2 and 2 do not only equal 4 in virtue of, you know, some fact about his nature or something. Like, that's just a necessary truth. And being omniscient, he grasps the necessary truths. And since these are moral reasons, he can see, you know, the way that things ought to be and ought not to be. And, you know, what would be better, you know, one state of affairs would be better than some other state of affairs. But I don't think he's free to just impose different evaluative truths on the world. Like, so we just have the physical world, you know, where you've got, you know, this conscious being, this dog, you know, and it's being subjected to terrible animal cruelty. So that is the case, right? Like in this scenario. And I'm saying God is not free to impose a moral structure on the world, like a moral truth on the world where that is good or it is neither good nor bad. How do you explain that? I mean, how do you explain that without just being some kind of moral realist, you know?
It's not something just that you just make up. You have a personal purpose, that's your life, personal goals, right? But objective purpose comes from without, and it's the same thing for everything, right? That includes morality, right? So morality does have a purpose, but on theism, not on atheism. So I mean, that's kind of another thing that I'm not saying that, you know, purpose is a necessary feature of morality or something we have to explain, but it does make morality make a lot more sense.
Oh yeah, for sure, especially the reasons.
Yeah. So God can have moral reasons, and those reasons are actually referencing his own character. Maybe he commands me to do certain things because he's loving and doesn't want me to, I don't know, kill everyone. You know, just like it's very easy to give a story as to what his reasons would be, and even if he's referencing other things, like you ought not harm this.
He's loving and he doesn't want me to kill everyone. I wonder if he notices there's anything good about love and anything bad about killing everyone. I wonder if he noticed that. Maybe he noticed some features of the act itself and then issued those commands on the basis of that.
Person, or they're morally valuable, right? They have intrinsic moral value. He's like, oh, that's something external. No, because moral value is also dependent on God's nature. All right. So, yeah, I mean, that's all I think I'd say. That's all I had for that one.
Yeah, the intrinsicality of the value isn't undermined by pointing out once again, like the ontological ground of that intrinsic value. Those are completely consistent sets of things.
Look, the intrinsic value is not undermined by the fact that it's extrinsic. You know, being extrinsically valuable does not undermine its claim to being intrinsically valuable. Okay. Oh, thanks, MJ. Thanks for clearing that up for me.
Yeah. Actually, we can skip some of these because I think I've actually addressed some of these extra ones. So, like,
I'll go next.
Well, and I actually think the Euthyphro is useful, at least from the beginning, because it helps people understand divine command theory. But persistent use of it seems to betray either a person's understanding of divine command theory, where they don't really understand the actual theory, so they kind of trot this out. Of course, that's a different version. Classical versions, at the very least, I think betray someone's knowledge of divine command theory. But either they're doing that, or they're just kind of misunderstanding what divine command theorists are saying when they talk about moral obligations or God's commands.
Isn't this kind of on the level of what Emerson was complaining about at the beginning of the video? Isn't this what like atheist Frank Turks do? They just trot this out over and over again, and they don't know about all the meta-ethical like responses to it.
Yeah,
it's a pretty unsophisticated way to present it. Love Emerson.
I don't really know. I haven't really paid attention as much, but I really don't know many atheist meta-ethicists who actually trot this out as like a actual decent argument. I know. I mean, Poyman does. I think he kind of pulls out the.
Well, there's different like. Remember that conversation I was having with Darwin's Greatest Hits? He cited Morstan and some other guy. I forget his name. But
yeah, I was referring to meta-ethicists.
Yeah, like Craig responded to him once in his Q&A.
Yeah.
So there's different ways.
Yeah. And one thing, I'm actually kind of surprised at how much Willenberg and I agree on, given that I wrote my entire thesis against him. But he's equally as exhausted as I am. Like, he doesn't think it's a good argument, and he's wondering why people still use it. And I am too, kind of, other than a sort of kind of introductory tool to understand the actual theory itself. It's useful in that way, but I think that's as far as it goes. I don't think.
Just apply to moral realists. Like, is the property of being good because it exemplifies something above it, or is the property good because there's something about the property that makes its goodness good?
Flawless execution. That you really nailed that parody argument, Val.
I mean, you can do the same thing with any kind of realism, but they're forced to say something like, "Well, the property it's good intrinsically. It has that goodness necessarily in its own nature." Okay, that's what we're saying about God.
No, I'm saying the intrinsic features of the act are bad, and what would be the Euthyphro attack on that? Is it bad because what exactly? I mean, like. Because the Euthyphro, like the standard one, is like, is piety loved by the gods, like for some particular reason? Like, is it pious because they love it? Or do they love it because it's pious? Is it pious because they love it? Because they love it. They're loving it is what makes it pious. Or do they love it because they recognize the piety of such and such an act? So that's like the original framing. I'm just trying to think like how would you apply that style of argument to saying, well, I just think it's intrinsically wrong to like torture someone just for the hell of it. It's just intrinsically bad. Like the features of the act itself, that is where the buck stops. That is where the explanation ends. Like, that something would cause immense harm for no purpose whatsoever. That is itself a reason to not do it. What the fuck is the Euthyphro dilemma posed to that? I mean, there's not one that obviously presents itself. Because there aren't two things here. Like I'm trying to think of like, because in the Euthyphro, there's the gods and then there's the pious, or, there's God and the good. And here we have the intrinsic features of the act and what? Like what, and then once that second thing is identified, then what's the Euthyphro? So it's like the intrinsic features of the act are what make it bad. Okay, so is it bad because of the intrinsic features of the act, or are the intrinsic features of the act bad because of the intrinsic features, or is the badness because of the intrinsic features, or are they intrinsic because of the badness? Like what? I don't understand how that would even apply, but It's bad because of the intrinsic features of the act. That's the answer. Like, if there was even a Euthyphro to be had here, I would just grab one of those horns and be like, that's the answer. And by the way, I don't present... Like, when I presented the Euthyphro, I said, by the way, theists have a response to this, and it's a good response. It's, God commands such and such because it's good, because it's evil. He commands us not to do it. But that implies that God has moral knowledge of the moral facts. That implies that some form of secular moral realism is true. That's supposed to be why it's a dilemma. But of course, it's not a dilemma because, when it's a dilemma, there's supposed to be two bad options. But there aren't two bad options. There's only one bad option. It's only good because God commands it. Or it's only valuable in virtue of God's existence or something like that. That's the bad answer. The divine command theory answer. It's not really a dilemma because there's a perfectly good answer. It's just you have to give up this idiotic moral argument, which most theistic philosophers have.
I wish which one do you want to
So the folly of atheist moral realists, they just don't see that there's an exactly perfect Euthyphro dilemma. Let's try to answer his Euthyphro dilemma, by the way, real quick. Whatever dumb shit he actually said.
Something above it.
They'll use it. I am too, kind of, other than a sort of kind of introductory tool to understand the actual theory itself. It's useful in that way. But I think that's as far as it goes. I don't think it's...
Just apply to moral realists. Like, is the property of being good because it exemplifies something above it?
Is the property of being morally good because it exemplifies something above it? No. There's a very straightforward answer. No.
Or is the property good because there's something about the property that makes its goodness good?
Or is the property good because there's something about the property that makes it good? It's that option. That's what I said, basically. The intrinsic features of the act. Like, that's sort of the truth maker. There you go. Problem solved.
You know what I mean? You can do the same thing with any kind of realism. But they're forced to say something like, well, the property it's good intrinsically. It has that goodness necessarily in its own nature.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's crazy how I say suffering is bad and love is good. You just have to say suffering is bad because of its intrinsic properties? Yes. Makes a lot of sense to me. Suffering is bad because of how it feels.
Yeah, that's what we're saying about God. 48, 38, 48, 34, 29.
Intrinsically wrong with baby torture, requiring an external value imposer like God to make it the case that such acts are wrong. Asserting that God delivers his injunctions because of his nature doesn't really answer the question of moral arbitrariness. Why is his nature as it is? Replying that God is necessarily good doesn't answer the question at hand, since secular moral non-naturalists and theistic moral non-naturalists believe that moral truths are necessary. They obtain in all possible worlds. God's necessarily moral character could be intimately related to such normative truths. God is necessarily good? Well, maybe that's because God is omniscient and because there are non-natural, irreducibly normative truths that obtain across all possible worlds, just like there are mathematical truths that obtain across all possible worlds. In that case, the theist would have a convincing answer to the Euthyphro dilemma. They can keep God's necessarily good nature, and you don't have to defend nonsense arguments against secular moral realists.
So, I didn't quite understand it completely. What's he saying?
Hey, here's a life hack, MJ. If you want to understand what I'm saying, then play more than 10 seconds of it at a time. That will really help you comprehend why I'm saying the sentences that I am fucking saying. Goddamn idiot. I have given you so much more space to share your thoughts about this than you've given me to share mine. And like I said, I really planned out this video, and it seems like you did not plan out your video. So before I had no opinion of you, and now I positively dislike you.
Is he saying that God is good because he knows all the necessarily true moral propositions, or the propositions are necessarily true because God knows them?
No, I think he was saying that God knows whatever this external standard is outside of him, and so since he knows that, he's good because
he knows it. It's two separate things, and he can know all about good and not be good.
Yeah, but his nature is a certain
Well, then
way,
you're not a moral internalist.
right? And it I guess it necessarily relates to this external state or somehow. It's
Yeah,
kind of
even if it
unclear.
If it does necessarily relate to it, why does that automatically mean that God is going to be consistent with whatever those?
So, I said this is not really confusing. I'm just saying that, like, you could imagine that Eric Wielenberg and Michael Humer and Russ Schaefer Landau and Justin Crummett, Terence Cuneo, I think, and other theists as well, not just atheists or agnostics, who are moral non-naturalists, and they think that God is omniscient, so he knows all the moral facts, and he knows all the moral reasons to do and not do certain things, and why certain states of affairs are better than other states of affairs, and he has reason to bring about those states of affairs because they are good. Again, that comes down to your view of like moral reasons and everything. I'm just saying that if God's omniscient and moral realism is true, then he knows all the moral facts. And if this kind of, I keep saying moral internalism, I wish I could pull up that paper really quickly. Actually, you know what? Let me just pause for 1 second and try to pull it up. Okay, sorry about that diversion. So the paper is called Evilism, Moral Rationalism, and Reason's Internalism by Christopher Gregory Weaver. Here's the abstract. I show that the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent, and essentially omnimalevolent being is impossible, given only two metaethical assumptions, moral rationalism and reason's internalism. And then he argues this undercuts the evil God challenge. So moral rationalism and reason's internalism, which, by the way, I think this argument works. This is the SEP entry. This is the section internalism versus externalism in the entry on moral motivation. Traditionally, judgment internalism has been characterized as claiming either that a motivation is internal to moral judgment, in the sense that moral judgment itself motivates without need of an accompanying desire, or that there's a necessary connection between moral judgment and motivation. Okay, so yeah, traditionally, these are the two types of internalism with respect to moral motivation, meaning that like there are these special categories of moral reasons that are motivating, right? So like the moral judgment itself, like the grasping of the moral reason, gives you some motivation without any accompanying desire. So this is like a rejection of Humeanism about desires and reasons. So Hume says reason is the slave of the passions. Reasons by themselves don't give you any motive for acting. Okay, so Hume is definitely not an internalist, whereas internalists in this specific sense of moral motivation, they think that once you grasp the moral reason, you have grasped like a reason to do that thing. It's like inherently motivating. Like a reason to not do a certain action would be that it would be a rotten thing to do. Like that itself is a reason to not do it. And assuming you're capable of really grasping those reasons of why you ought not do it, then that is at least some motivation to not do it. Yeah, so they were distinguishing in that article between two different kinds, like a stronger form where it says moral judgment itself motivates without need of an accompanying desire. So that's like in contrast to Hume, who thinks there always has to be some desire that's there. And by desire, he doesn't just mean motivation, because then that would not be, we're talking about moral motivation, motivation that is like intimately connected with moral reasons. So it's not just any old type of motivation. It has to, like, he's saying there are motivations that are like different from what you're talking about if you're going to like distinguish the Humean position from the non-Humean position, because we're all talking about motivation. We're all talking about reasons for acting and things that motivate our actions. Okay, so like you have to distinguish between certain kinds of motives and other kinds of motives. And the Humean claim is like, well, look, there are these appetites and desires that we have that motivate our action, and we just use reason to basically realize and accomplish and fulfill our appetites and desires. And then the non-Humeans are saying, well, of course we do that, yes. But there are like these prudential reasons, and then there are these impartial reasons, So like that something is wrong, that something is unfair, for instance, or unjust. That is a reason to not do it itself. And once you grasp that it's unjust, you will have some motivation for not doing it. There doesn't have to be some accompanying appetite. So the internalist view is like a non-Humean view, saying that like once you grasp the moral reasons, they are inherently motivating. You do not need some kind of, like non-moral appetite or desire that is like actually propelling you. You grasp the moral reasons, and when you grasp the moral reasons, then you have a reason for acting one way or not some other way or something like that. The judgment itself motivates without need of an additional desire. So, that it's wrong, that it's unjust, that it's unfair. That's it. Those are reasons for not doing it, so that's like roughly the internalist view. It's at the very least that there's some kind of necessary connection between moral judgment and moral motivation.
Necessarily moral propositions are specifying about.
It's kind of unclear.
It doesn't necessarily relate to it. Why does that automatically mean that God is going to be consistent with whatever those necessarily moral propositions are specifying about good and bad conduct?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
okay. So the reason I wanted to say all that is because of their claim here, which is in contrast to Christopher Gregory Weaver's claim when he's trying to argue against the evil God challenge. He says, well, look, the evil God challenge doesn't work because an omniscient being, given moral rationalism and reasons internalism, I mean, look, once he grasps these moral reasons, once he makes these moral judgments, once he grasps the moral facts, well, then he will be motivated to be good. If you read the paper, he goes into more detail. He like rejects certain kinds of internalism and accepts like other modified forms. This is like a very rough sketch of what he argues for. But basically he says, look, an evil God is actually not possible because, on the assumption that these two meta-ethical ideas are correct, moral rationalism and reasons internalism. And it's like, once you are an internalist in this sense, then it's impossible that God could be omniscient and omnimalevolent. Okay, so their response relies on a total rejection of that kind of internalism. So here are a few problems with that. One, Chris explicitly said he denies it earlier. A second problem with that is that I don't know what the better, I don't know of a better response to the evil God challenge than that. Third problem is that you're going to have to reject Swinburne's approach in kind of getting many divine attributes out of one. So like he tries to start with, I think just one, I don't know if it's perfection or unlimited power, but he starts with like, one attribute and then he gets a bunch of other attributes from that one. So like whether or not he gets omniscience from unlimited power is beside the point. But like if you have omniscience, then if you grant these two meta-ethical assumptions that Weaver talks about, then you have omnibenevolence. So yeah, you can just say, well, I believe God is omniscient, and then from that you can get omnibenevolence, right? And all that requires is those two meta-ethical assumptions. And like I said, I think that argument basically works, but I'm sympathetic to those two meta-ethical assumptions. Moral rationalism and reasons internalism. So that is a very, very rough sketch of that internalist-externalist debate and why someone might think that what these two are saying is complete horseshit.
You give them just possibilities like, well, why can't God exist? And then the non-naturalist also be correct about these external things that God refers to in order to issue commands and things. Like, okay, that's not the theory though. That's not divine command theory. You might say that's possible. I actually don't think it is possible. I think.
Okay, this is just like pure confusion on his part. That's not divine command theory. I know, dipshit. The whole fucking video is opposed to divine command theory, and I said if I were a theist, I wouldn't be a divine command theorist. I would accept this, and then I said moral non-naturalism plus theism. He's like, well, that's not divine command theory. Holy fucking shit! You're like not keeping up at all with what I'm talking about.
I think it's actually impossible, and I can go into several reasons for why. But I'm actually trying to remember why I had that one in there. I said can't get rid of arbitrariness because when it comes to arbitrariness, because when it comes to God commanding certain things, but then we ask why God's nature is that way, and to say it's necessary isn't enough since we could say the same about moral truths. They're just necessary and no need of explanation. Okay, that's why I had it. So yeah, it's not true that I'm sorry. I just disagree that moral truths are necessary and have no need of explanation because they have all these extremely, as Mackie would say, queer features that don't make any sense if God doesn't exist. Like
once again, though,
God has no queer features.
The features thing, correct. I agree with that. And then apply it to what is Emerson Green a moral realist about? Give me the explanation for why the property exemplifies goodness without appealing to the property. So either you're going to have to go above and beyond the property, or you're going to make whatever goodness is attaching to that property arbitrary. You do the same thing. You have to say like it's
okay,
just
let's
something
take this
that the property.
Extremely stupid objection seriously for a second. Let's answer those questions.
What is Emerson Green a moral realist about? Give me the explanation for why the property exemplifies goodness without appealing to the property. So either you're going to
explain how the property exemplifies goodness without appealing to the property. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what question he's asking. Why the property exemplifies goodness without appealing to the property? Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. 1 second.
have to go above and beyond the property, or you're going to make whatever goodness is attaching to that property arbitrary.
Okay, so when I say suffering is bad, and then I appeal to the feeling of suffering, in what way am I doing anything that you're talking about?
You do the same thing. You have to
You're getting all twisted up in these like silly metaphysical knots. Like you barely understand what you're saying or what's happening around you. And when it comes down to it, the supposedly ridiculous thing I'm saying is that suffering is bad because of how it feels. Once you feel suffering, you understand its badness. You feel it and you're like, oh, that's not good. I'm evaluating this as bad. That's the supposedly ridiculous thing that I'm saying.
Like it's just something that the property has in its own nature. But then unfortunately, the property doesn't have all the necessary traits that you need for there to be a moral claim in the first place. Like there's nothing authoritatively scary about a property. We always joke around about it.
Yeah.
So
or propositions.
What are you talking about? I'm just saying suffering is bad.
Sorry.
Yeah. What's our next one here? Oh, yeah, that's 5914. Yeah. Which we've actually answered this before, but we'll do it again in this video.
Commands. Should we obey God's commands because God commands us to obey his commands? Well, I mean, I don't think so. Should we obey God's commands because God commands us?
You see him? He's thinking through it out loud, like in real time.
Which is great. That's fine.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Because I feel like something clicked for a second. Because that's exactly.
I'm sarcastically asking what is self-evidently a retarded question. Like, should we obey God's commands because he commanded us to obey God's commands? That's the issue we're trying to figure out. Should we obey God's commands? And you say, well, he commanded us to obey his commands. It's like, oh my God, I think he's thinking through this.
What would be consistent with that view? If divine command theory were true and God is the good, then all he has to do is say, okay, all my commands relate to particular object level obligations, and you ought to do whatever it is that these obligations are specifying you to do in terms of being action guiding. And follow all those commands, including this one. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no vicious regrets or anything.
Right. I mean, so it seems to be there seems to be kind of two options here. It's either a non-vicious infinite regress. Right? Well, actually, you don't have to do that. You actually have that third option in there, but hold on. So non-vicious infinite regress, sort of like when you say X is true, it is true that X is true, it's true that it's true that X is true.
Yeah.
It's the same. I mean, it would be the same kind of thing. Or you could say there's an extra one that encompasses all of them and includes itself in the set. Right. So is it you ought to obey all my commands or something?
Wow. Okay. Who knew that because I said so is such a philosophically sophisticated response?
Well, that includes all of them. Right? Or the third is if we're not going to go with any of those, then it turns out to be a problem for all meta-ethical views worth their salt. Right. So you have to have a stopping point somewhere. Right. And the question isn't whether there is a stopping point; it's what stopping point you're going to land on. Right. And Willenberg mentioned this.
This is so tiring because I address everything that they're talking about. Like I said, you might think that like it's just obvious that, the basic truth is we ought to obey God. But then I could just ask all the annoying questions you're asking about the metaphysical status of that fact that we ought to obey God.
Pretty clearly, I think, and I think Emerson does too when he talks about moral primitives, right? So I mean, I don't think it's circular, and again, it must be an infinite regress, but it could also just be a reasonable, non-arbitrary stopping point, which I think is much less arbitrary than abstract objects. And later,
no, dude, you're fucking talking about how these facts don't have authority, blah blah blah, and then I say, why obey God? Why should I respect the authority of God? And you start talking about theoretical primitives, and all explanations have to stop somewhere. So in the end, do you have a better answer to the authority problem, quote unquote, than I do? I mean, I'm sorry, but I think that suffering is bad is a more obvious, like, axiomatic starting point than we ought to obey the commands of the tripersonal first cause. Just one man's opinion.
He calls the question, why should I obey God's commands, and the question, why should I be moral, as equivalent, right? So I mean, if they're equivalent, they have equivalent answers, right?
Yep.
So I mean, and he brought that up, and I don't have a timestamp for this, but he brought that up in the context of, with theists ask atheists for a moral foundation. Like you say, well, on atheism, how can you be moral, or why should you be moral, etc. But the answers aren't going to be the same here. Actually, it turns out, at least for why you should be moral on atheism. Like, so they'd be the same, I think, on theism. That's because I think you have to have theism to actually ground morality. So when atheists ask atheists that, they're not asking why should I be moral exactly, not directly asking why should I be moral on atheism. They're asking how does morality even make sense on atheism, because those are a bit different.
You know, for the record, I said I don't really care. I didn't say it's illegal for you to stop at we ought to obey God's commands. I just said it doesn't make any sense that this would be grounded in God himself. And I said, how, like, what would this fact be other than exactly the kind of moral facts that you are objecting to so vociferously? Like, what else would this be other than the kind of abstract moral truth that apparently is just inherently motivating, inherently authoritative, and all that? Like, so I didn't say you can't just I said it's annoying when people ask the question that you explicitly asked earlier, and that you said, oh, I just wouldn't be moral if I weren't a theist. And I said, yeah, it's kind of annoying when people say, well, sure, something can be objectively right and objectively wrong, but why should I be motivated to do that which is objectively right or something? I said, oh, that's kind of an annoying question, and it's one ultimately about moral motivation, I feel. And it's like, maybe you could say the same thing. I said, maybe you'd feel equally annoyed when I ask this question, why obey God? Why should I obey God? And what I didn't say, you can't do that. You know, you can't make this move of saying, oh, it's just kind of a brute fact that you ought to obey God. I didn't say you can't do that. I just said, if you do that, then you're accepting the existence of just like one moral fact that is like not grounded in God, which is super weird. It seems to have all the costs that are supposedly attached to my view, but it's like, that's the only moral fact, and then the other ones all come from God. And I kind of thought that was obvious. That's like a dumb view. But yeah, I don't see how we ought to obey God's commands could be grounded in God's commands, because that is just obviously circular.
Right. Sort of the making sense of versus the why should I be moral on atheism.
How about this? You ought to obey me. Why? Because I said you ought to obey me. Why? Because I said you ought to obey me. Does that make sense to you?
Atheists, like, act moral, right? Because they sense a morality out there. They have moral perceptions. They know that certain things are right or wrong, and so they act accordingly, and that's good.
Yeah, everybody does. We all use flashlights to find our keys in the dark.
Yeah, but then my question is like, well, why are you acting that way? Like, how does that way make sense?
Why?
Like, why would you?
I've asked myself many times, and a question I've been wondering the same about you too. Why are you acting this way? Why are you like this? Can't you just be normal?
Aren't you just doing what will give you sort of the most pleasure or sort of like temporary happiness or something? I mean, you can keep doing that, obviously, and that's kind of exhausting. That's because, when you look for happiness, that's when it kind of eludes you. But yeah, I mean, that'd be my question. How does morality make sense on atheism? Right? Well, here's what we do. We get the datum of moral experience, and then we have to explain all of that. So we come to agree on certain the datum of moral experience. Like, okay, so do you think this is it? So authority, if there are obligations, so they're authoritative.
I like how we've made zero progress We're an hour and 20 minutes into their video, and he's just saying, but how does morality make sense on atheism? But I just don't get it. Like, literally nothing has changed. We are standing on a fucking treadmill.
They're also sort of intentional. They have all these different features, moral value, more transformation. You can go back in walls for actually a good list of that. And say, now, how do we explain these, right? And I'll probably go back to authority for virtually everything, because I think if you toss that, then you just toss morality to me.
Yeah.
And there have been people who have actually tried to tackle that problem of authority, and then they just gave up on morality. And I can reference them, if I'm asked.
Authority is necessary and sufficient for morality, because, like I said, it's sufficient because everything else falls out from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
I mean, without a proper
I think
analysis of authority, I can't really say that's true or false. I mean, the way I understand authority, as I mentioned, is like you not only have power, but you have like legitimate power. And they seem to be adding this further condition of like motivation. So as far as I can tell, the way they're using it, this is my best guess, is that for moral rules to have authority, they have to be true and powerful and legitimate and motivating. It's just so exhausting, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all I had.
Well, the other thing I was going to say too is you mentioned like recursiveness and sets and all this stuff. Obey all my commands. The other way I saw Craig deal with it was in terms of quantification. Like you have a universal, you can have a universal quantifier just for all x. If x is a command, then it constitutes an obligation, and there's nothing about that universal quantification that would exclude and follow the command to do all the commands. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it universally quantifies over every command, no matter how much you do the recursive dance. All right, what's the next timestamp?
Before we move on, it's just like I did spend some time talking about here are some potential theistic answers to why obey God. Why would these moral truths have authority? Why would they be motivating? Why would they take precedent over other concerns or considerations? And I said, here are a couple good answers, here are a couple bad answers. And it looks like we're just not even going to discuss that. Cool.
Hour 14 and 15. So an hour and 14 minutes, 15 seconds.
Quote, now the first problem for Craig's account of morality is that it is simply not an objectivist theory. If true, it makes morality subjective, not objective. This is because Craig holds that morality constitutively depends on the attitudes of an observer. The observer in this case is a very interesting one, but an observer nonetheless. Craig might object. He might say that morality is objective as long as it doesn't depend on human observers. It can still depend on non-human observers. I try not to spend too much time on semantic debates, so I will just say that I think this would be an artificial way of drawing boundaries. Physical facts, the paradigm of objectivity, are not constitutively dependent on any observers whatsoever. They can exist by themselves. If one says that moral facts need some special observer, then one is conceding that they are not objective in the robust sense that physical facts are. In that case, I think one's view is more like that of thinkers who reduce morality to facts about other observers' attitudes than it is like the ones who hold that moral facts are just as objective as physical facts. Eric Wielenberg and I are robust moral realists. We think moral facts are independent of anyone's attitudes. Next to us, Craig is the subjectivist in the room. So Craig doesn't agree that his divine command.
Okay, so the quotes, you can see at the bottom is from my humor. And
I like how even when they play clips of me talking, it's me quoting someone else, which I guess is fair enough. Like I am just trying to communicate stuff from like professional meta-ethicists and explain why it contradicts stuff that apologists say. But, I had some interesting things to say in the middle there, I think. And so far, like at least half of the clips they've played from my video have just been other people talking or like me quoting other people. And like I said, I would rather have someone like Humor, defending our meta-ethical views than me and Schaefer Landau and Wielenberg. Like they are all like, really great philosophers. But I don't know. I guess there's just something weird to me about like only playing that shit. But I guess I can't really complain because this is what I wanted. I wanted to communicate like what these analytic philosophers have to say about metaethics. And they're pretty much just playing what these analytic philosophers are saying about metaethics.
And in the literature, he is the only person I can find that says this.
Yeah, you told me that you were searching for.
I remember him saying that.
Oh, humor saying that. Yeah, no, this is a hot take. We're an hour and 15 minutes into my 2-hour video. Well, we're not into it because they're playing it 10 seconds at a time. But yeah, I was not trying to represent. I mean, this is like ultimately a semantic question about like taxonomies and stuff. But like, if you're grounding morality in a person or 3 persons, then that's kind of what subjective means. We're kind of honing in on that territory, right? And if it's objective, then it probably doesn't depend on a person. Yeah, I mean, that is a hot take that I endorse. Me and humor are aligned in that. But I mean, it's just such bullshit to like turn around and be like, oh, well, actually, most people in analytic philosophy don't say this. And it's like, oh, do you suddenly care what the majority of people in analytic philosophy think? Because let's poll some people about whether secular moral realism is necessarily false. You going to respect the results of that? I mean, like, look, I'm aware that this thing about divine command theory being subjectivism, I'm aware that that's a hot take. I'm aware that I am not like representing a consensus view when I say that. That's why I defend it with arguments. It's like a pretty long section, But anyway, it's just such fucking bullshit to be like, just to totally disregard like the consensus of meta-ethicists in like every fucking area, and then randomly when it serves you, you're like, oh my god, the consensus of meta-ethicists, like they have a different view about this. And it's like, first of all, you don't care about that, you've already established. And second of all, when meta-ethicists do bring this up, they don't just say, well, humor is just wrong. Or like the people who say divine command theory is subjectivism, they're just wrong, is completely straightforward. They usually say something more nuanced than that. They usually say like, it's unclear, it's a gray area. Or they say, you know what, it's just not really that important. Who cares? Let's just talk about the substance of the view. Okay, whether it is or isn't a form of subjectivism, maybe it's in some kind of gray area in between. Maybe our conceptual dividing lines aren't perfect. But like they usually say something like it's unclear or it doesn't matter, or divine command theorists consider themselves to be like moral realists, so let's just go with that. So it's not like they say humor is wrong, like that the consensus is that divine command theory is unambiguously a form of moral objectivism. That's not even the consensus view, for the record.
And I was thinking, man, I can't remember anybody else saying this. And so I went and looked for, meta-ethicists. I looked at several of the intro meta-ethics books I've read, and the ones I haven't read, I can't find anybody else who says this, including moral psychologists. In fact, oh
my God, moral psychologists haven't weighed in on the meta-ethical taxonomy? Oh, how strange.
I was just reading an article in Moral Psychology today, and even there, they don't take it that way.
Wow, it's truly strange that moral psychologists are not talking about divine command theory more. That's really odd. This is like, in a strong contest, this is one of the more baffling things that you've said. Oh, moral psychologists don't talk about this.
Right. So, and I'll quote in a second, but I mean, people like Willenberg, Schaefer-Landau, Enoch, David O'Brink, Alexander Miller, Simon Kirchen, and the divine command theorists, like they take divine command theory to be an objectivist theory. And they do so either explicitly in several cases or implicitly, which is...
Can I list off a bunch of theists who are not divine command theorists now, since you suddenly are very concerned with the majority opinion of meta-ethicists? And by the way, just saying that they don't say this is not the same thing as like they considered the arguments that you are not playing right now and think that they're wrong and have like issued their rebuttals or something.
When it comes to their understanding of objectivity, right? I think humor is in the extreme minority here, and I think it's better to think of divine command theory as an objectivist meta-ethical theory with a constructive function, and it's concerning moral obligations.
It's an objective constructivist theory. Cool.
It talks about moral obligations.
This coming from the guy who doesn't know if relativism should or shouldn't count as moral realism.
So, I mean, divine command theory posits moral truths that are response independent that serve as explanatory priors to moral obligations. right, which are constructed or created via divine commands. So, they're either constituted by or they're identical with. So, I mean, if you'd like to claim that robust realists are better and more hardcore objectivists than divine command theorists, then, I mean, be my guest.
Okay.
I don't care about that part, but I think it's kind of extreme to call divine command theory a subjectivist theory.
Mhm.
I mean, the constructivists utilize like a function, depending on the theory, which defines different inputs for the same output, which is more reality. So, I mean, if you want to go to subjectivist, you can say they take taste and opinion or attitudes as the input, while divine command theorists take God's nature and character as the input.
Yeah, constructivists and subjectivists are not moral realists. They're moral anti-realists.
Right. So, and they're not the same. Like you can take Seyfried Landau. So I'll quote him here. He says, realism is sometimes contrasted with constructivism by invoking that for realists, morality is mind independent. There is some truth to this, but it seems ill expressed by the present notion. Any plausible moral theory will claim that moral truths depend crucially on an agent's mental states. We obviously can't enter a moral assessment of an agent's motivations and intentions without recourse to what is going on in her mind. And the moral status of an action may depend very importantly on how pleased or miserable it makes others, whether it prompts feelings of anger or empathy, whether one who is harmed has given the consent to the treatment, etc. Further, it seems to make eminent sense to say that absent all agents, there would be no moral facts. Right? No particular instances of right or wrong, moral good or evil, etc. We must be careful to define realism in such a way as to allow for these home truths. Then he says, divine command theories seem most naturally grouped with realism, even though on these accounts there is a constructive function that explains the correctness of the proper moral standards. For my purposes, it doesn't much matter how we solve this taxonomic problem. All divine command theories incorporate a constructive function to be sure, but it's also the case that the relevant standard-setting attitudes are not those of any human being. The attitudes, no matter how refined, of us mere mortals do not do the relevant work. Okay, that's typical.
That's fine. That's a completely reasonable thought. I mean, everything he just said is interesting, thoughtful, and he says, I think it's best thought of as an objectivist theory, even though it lacks a couple features of other objectivist theories. It's like, that's fine. I mean, like, that's a perfectly respectable view. I mean, I really have nothing to add other than their view is not Schaefer Landau's view in the paragraph that they just read. So, I mean, like, you're very selectively taking from that paragraph
of metaethicists when they talk about this. Like, it's everywhere. It seems almost ubiquitous, right?
Are you gonna fucking engage with the video that I made, or no?
They almost always refer to humans. I actually wouldn't do that personally. I'd say finite agents, right? So yes, it does matter if you're infinite, and if you're infinite, you're gonna. There's an argument for this later, but you're one person, an infinite person, right? So we're talking about infinite persons here. Historically, ethics has a scope, believe it or not. Ethics is the point of ethics is to actually give you a guide to life. Finite agents are the ones that need guides to life. Infinite agents do not, right? By God, we mean a perfect being.
Just be careful. You got to underline that too. Like, a being cannot have infinity unless it's part of a package.
Yeah. It seems to be kind of all or nothing, right? So God is a perfect being. He's an infinite being. He doesn't need a guide to life. Ethics is not he is not in the scope of ethics. And metaethics is about ethics. So when we talk about something, when we're talking about something, so about ethics, we need to also be kind of referring to a similar scope, right? Or relevant with similar scope when we're talking about it, right? And this is I will say this is not like Emerson's doing anything wrong here. I actually think that plenty of metaethicists don't actually explicitly say this because it's just been kind of like one of those things that's just kind of ingrained in the discussion, so that a lot of people don't say that explicitly. They'll treat it that way and then not say anything about it. But there are plenty that will, like Alexander Miller in his introduction to metaethics, Simon Kirchen in his several articles I was reading today said the exact same thing. They refer to humans. This isn't just Craig doing this, right? This seems to be most metaethicists doing this. I don't know actually if I have the quotes down here of all those, but I mean, I quoted Schaefer Landau just kind of give you an idea. Just kind of give you an idea of what kind of metaethicists tend to think. And Schaefer Landau is like editor for the Oxford Study of Metaethics. So like he knows.
Schaefer Landau is opposed to almost every single thing that you've said in this entire video. Why do you suddenly fucking care so much about what he says? Like, why do you suddenly care about the consensus of metaethicists? Why are you suddenly being like, well, thus saith Russ Schaefer Landau? Like, what the fuck do you care, man? And like I said, I think Schaefer Landau's opinion here is perfectly respectable, well thought out. It is slightly different from my own opinion, but it is a very reasonable opinion to hold. Okay, but there are reasons that I think that I'm right about this, reasons which I explain in the video that you are not playing right now that you are supposedly responding to.
What objectivity is, and I'm one of those people too that think that. Yeah, so I'm one of those people that think that in order to be a moral realist, you have to believe in objective moral facts, right? So, and divine command theorists do believe in objective moral.
I'm one of those moral realists that thinks you need to believe in moral objectivity to be a moral realist. Oh, it's a bit of a hot take there.
Facts by definition, by the standard definition of metaethics, right? So I think they're objectivists. But I would say that even if it weren't true that they were objectivists, that somehow we could shoehorn them into being subjectivists. I mean, Craig is right, when he mentions like contingency and arbitrariness being the typical problems that we have with subjectivism. Like that's kind of the two huge problems that people tend to have with it. They just don't really apply on divine command theory. So if you want to call them subjectivists, but just deny the problems that subjectivist theories tend to have, right? I mean, you can do that. But I don't see a reason to do that other than, well, humor does see a reason, but that's because he extends the scope of ethics to everything, which is not typical, right? And I like most of Hume's work. I just disagree with him here. I think if also we could actually turn this around. I think if divine command theory is a subjectivist theory, right? If morality has the foundation of morality can't have anything to do with mental states at all, like any persons.
Nope.
I think
that's not what the claim is. That's not the motivation for saying divine command theory is a form of subjectivism. It's so frustrating seeing people who are, like Chris, who are not dumb, seemingly. At least he doesn't strike me as particularly dumb. He's just talking about things like without knowing, like without properly researching what he's commenting on. So he's saying like, oh, well, here's what the motivation supposedly is for categorizing it this way. Like, let me play again what he said.
Right. If morality has the foundation of morality can't have anything to do with mental states at all.
Yeah. So by subjectivism, Humer does not create his taxonomy and says, well, if it has anything whatsoever to do with mental states or minds, then that's a form of subjectivism. He explicitly says that's not the case. I explicitly say it's not the case. In the defining terms section, I have a long section on subjective morality. I say, here's what it is. Here's what it's not. I say subjective morality in the context of metaethics does not mean having something vaguely to do with a mind. That is not what subjectivism means, and here's why it doesn't mean that. I'm not just appealing to consensus. I gave an argument. To say, here's why subjectivism shouldn't be defined in the way that he just defined it. Like if it has anything to do with a mind whatsoever, then it counts as moral subjectivism. I said that first of all, that's not how it's used in metaethics. So there's that, appeal to how metaethicists use the terms. But here's an argument. The argument is that there is no longer any distinction between subjectivism and hedonism. But there are clearly coherent positions on offer, like subjectivist hedonism, objectivist hedonism, and subjectivist non-hedonism that make no sense if you define subjective in this way in metaethics. So like you have not given yourself adequate conceptual room for all these different options if you define subjective in this way, just having anything whatsoever to do with a mind. And like the character of mental states or whatever. So I make that argument in the defining term section, about subjectivism, So anyway, it's just so annoying because Chris doesn't seem like a complete moron. And it's like, he's like, well, let me just spout off about this without having like, I mean, look, I know it's a long video. I know it's 2 hours long, but like, for fuck's sake, respond to what I'm saying. Respond to what I'm thinking. You're just like, you're so far removed from anything that I said at this point. You're saying, well, assuming this is the right definition of subjective, here's a really great argument. And it's like, I explicitly reject in the video and helpfully gave some timestamps just in case you had any question about that, Anyway, it's just frustrating to hear someone criticize your view, when they're not really familiar with your view.
I don't see a reason to do that other than, well, Humer does see a reason, but that's because he extends the scope of ethics to everything.
That's not why.
Which is not typical, right? And I like most of Hume's work. I just disagree. I just disagree with him here. I think if also we could actually turn this around. I think if divine command theory is a subjectivist theory, right? If morality has to have, the foundation of morality can't have anything to do with mental states at all, like any persons, I think the price tag for objectivism skyrockets, right? Because now morality becomes completely apersonal and impotent, right? And
so true.
For various reasons that we've already talked about, right? That you can't impersonal and impotent reality doesn't care.
I have no clue what that even means, but it's like, well, if you define subjective in this stupid way that he doesn't define it, then here's a really bad argument against doing that. It becomes impotent and impersonal. What? Like, I mean, first of all, that's a dumb argument. I mean, if I'm talking about abstract objects, then they're, they don't have causal effects anyway. And just saying it's impersonal, it's like, yeah, that's what I mean by objective. Is like it doesn't like depend on a person in the sense that I defined in that subjectivism section. I'm not going to rehash all that here, but like subjectivism in metaethics is defined in a particular way, and as I said, there are some good reasons for doing that.
Yeah, it doesn't care.
There's no such thing as morality anymore.
Yeah, and by the way, this is kind of a side point that I will leave people this for homework for people. There is a difference.
Hey, I have some homework for you. Watch the video that you're responding to.
I don't know how many philosophers. I haven't looked too much into how many, but there's a difference between objective, non-objective, and subjective, right? So there are theories that are non-objective but not exactly subjective, right? So you could, if you wanted to, you could take it as a non-objective theory or something, depending on what on some people that you read. But I actually don't know of any of those people. I know you can. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy does have that non-objective portion in there.
Subjective and objective.
I also say at the end of this section, I'm sympathetic to just setting the table in a different way, where divine command theory wouldn't really count as a subjectivist theory. That's how this section ends. Anyway, it's just so frustrating. Not only are they not engaging with my view, sometimes they're engaging with like something that I explicitly reject and attributing it to me.
Or contraries, not contradictories, I guess.
Yeah. So
now, what's funny is, does Emerson end up like dealing with Craig's 3 responses that he has towards this view?
Hey, I know of an easy way to find that out, MJ. Play the fucking video. The answer is yes.
He does. He does bring up the. Actually, I think I have it.
I discerned 3 responses. So if he dealt with all 3, I'd like to know what he said.
Then
he quotes.
Then play the video.
Right.
Yeah,
I wish I knew what he said in this video that I'm responding to.
I have up right here.
Yeah.
I have it up. Now, exactly. Now, so the first response is the nature is observer independent. It's not up to God what his nature is, right? That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is if you want to make God a stance, then and make that subjective, that makes the external world subjective. Because without God, there'd be no external world. Without God upholding it,
talk about that.
Right. So it's dependent on God's stance with regard to the world. And then
I like how he's just scrolling through this fucking section from Craig in the book. Like, I quote this section at length. It's the longest quote in the entire fucking video. Like Craig's response. And then I go through it piece by piece. It's an entire fucking section of the video. And he's just like scrolling through the same paper that I'm quoting and then responding to and saying, oh, Craig says this. Does he even respond to this? If he responds to this, I'd like to know. How is this real? This fucking video.
Third reason is this application of relativity theory from special theory of relativity, where simultaneity relations are observer dependent, but not subjective.
Mm-hmm.
So does he have a response to that? Do you remember?
I think he did, but I don't remember exactly what it was.
Okay. Well,
this is the world's greatest response video.
Look it up later then.
But look at it later. What, is there going to be another response video?
There's 3 responses, and then whatever Emerson says in response. Sorry, Emerson.
Yeah. Well,
apology not accepted.
for humor. So humor says something constitutively depends upon something else, just in case that that property is at least partly constituted by its tendency to elicit a certain reaction from observers.
Hey, there it is. You found the definition of subjective that I referenced 85 times in the video.
I actually have a quote here too. So part of what it is for a thing to be so subjective is for observers to have or be disposed to have some particular sort of reaction to it. Well, if that's the case, if that's the case, that doesn't even apply to God and moral obligations, because he doesn't have a reaction to it. It's not a reaction to it. Like he just creates them because they're divine. They're either constituted by or identical with commands. He just creates them. He doesn't react to it. It doesn't exist yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
So even on that, I don't see how that applies to divine command theory. But even if it did, I think it says more against his interpretation of the constitutive dependence than it does against divine command theory.
Okay. All right. Next time, just let me know, and then we'll just end it and do a part 2 or something tomorrow. It'll probably be like another 20 minutes or something.
Oh.
We might be able to finish this, so let's see.
And so does Craig. Let's check that. So next, Craig says, truth about right and wrong are not independent of God's attitudes. Now, when one reflects that much of what God morally wills and commands is willed and commanded by him necessarily, being entailed by the divine nature, and therefore neither contingent nor arbitrary, then the dependence of right and wrong on God's attitudes serves mainly to call into question humor's characterization of objective morality. Attitude dependence is supposed to express the contingency and arbitrariness of the feature so dependent.
Okay, this sounds like a charitable defense of Craig.
I'm quoting... Fuck it. I'm quoting William Lane Craig. Like, you on the most basic level, you don't know what's happening around you. I'm reading William Lane Craig, and you're like, this sounds like a charitable defense of William Lane Craig. Dude, you got to do your fucking homework. I mean, I'm not even going to reflect upon whether this was a waste of time for me to watch almost this entire video. But like, good fucking God. I've got a day job, man. I still manage to put out stuff that I like am careful about. Then the dependence of right and wrong on God's attitudes serves mainly to call into question humor's characterization of objective morality. Attitude dependence is supposed to express the contingency and arbitrariness of the feature so dependent.
Okay, this sounds like a charitable defense of Craig, at least.
Yeah, in fact, it's a quote from Craig.
Yeah, so this is good.
And that is what makes subjectivism and morality objectionable. So I think some theists would certainly have an issue with claiming that God does what he does necessarily, that his actions are necessary. But let's set that aside since...
Well, can I comment a little bit? Basically, like, I don't think all his actions are necessary, but when it comes to morality, right? Because his nature is the good.
Oh, that doesn't raise any problematic questions whatsoever. God has enough freedom to, such that his actions are not necessary. But when it comes to morality, especially, his actions are necessary. Oh, okay, well, that doesn't raise any further questions.
Whatever those commands are going to be as being rooted in that nature are going to be necessary. I don't think all his actions are necessary.
Yeah.
Theists don't really have their stories. Cool. Some of them are necessary, some of them aren't, and for some reason, his moral commands are necessary. But that doesn't mean that morality is like external to him or anything, or he's like responding to some facts or something. No, that would be crazy. It's right about divine freedom on the one hand and necessity on the other. I think Craig is only half right that attitude dependence is, quote, supposed to express the contingency and arbitrariness of the feature so dependent, and that is what makes subjectivism and morality objectionable.
Right.
So that's certainly part of what makes it objectionable. But I think what makes attitude dependence objectionable is not just contingency and arbitrariness, but just attitude dependence. It just seems like an implausible reduction. When we give examples like funniness or boringness as subjective, the point is not just to draw attention to contingency and arbitrariness. We're trying to induce an intellectual appearance.
Yeah, he's all over the place right here. Yeah. I can't really follow what he's saying.
That's because you're fucking stupid.
It's part of the problem if it's connected to contingency and arbitrariness, right? Mm-hmm. Those are sufficient conditions for thinking that what we're talking about is not... I
just can't follow what he's saying. He's all over the place. Well, okay, maybe if you continue listening, things will come into greater focus. But like what I said was, yeah, he's half right. Contingency and arbitrariness are part of what makes this subjectivism, moral subjectivism, implausible. But also, it just like in itself somehow seems like an implausible reduction. Like you're reducing moral truths to certain things, to like certain kinds of, reactions or dispositions or mental states or opinions or what have you. It depends on the form of subjectivism exactly. That's why that reaction comment earlier was so fucking stupid. But anyway, he's like contingency and arbitrariness. That's what makes it objectionable. I'm like, that is part of it, yes. But suppose I were to reduce moral truths to facts about rocks instead of facts about subjects. It's like you might say, well, hang on, there's some troubling contingency and arbitrariness to the, and I'd say, yeah, and in addition to that, it just does not seem that moral facts are about rocks. They do not seem grounded in facts about rocks. That just on its face seems wrong. So I was saying, yes, I mean, look, contingency and arbitrariness, that's part of the implausibility of moral subjectivism. And there are various ways of illustrating that. But what I was trying to say was when you are a moral subjectivist or a divine command theorist, you are a form of reductionist, because there are these things called moral truths. And you say, well, they have a grounding, they have something that's more fundamental to them. There's something from which these come in some broad sense. Okay, so you're a reductionist, whereas I am a non-reductionist about moral truths. I think the buck stops with certain moral truths, right? So there are certain intrinsic features of acts that make them right or wrong. And I'm saying, like, that's where the explanation comes to an end. It's just, suffering is bad. It just feels bad. That's the end of the story. It's not bad because God says it's bad or something about God's nature makes it the case that it's bad. It's like, no, just in virtue of how it feels, that's it. It's just the feeling of suffering, bad. Okay, so moral reductionism, right? I'm a non-reductionist and he's a reductionist. He takes these moral truths and he's like, oh, no. It's actually all about God's nature. That's the grounding. And I'm saying, like, well, reducing moral truths to subjects is problematic, as Craig says, because there seems to be these elements of contingency and arbitrariness. And morality is not supposed to be contingent or arbitrary. And what I'm saying is, additionally, the reduction base, just on its face, seems like you're doing it wrong. And then I gave a really exaggerated example, like, well, what if someone said moral facts are grounded in facts about the rocks outside my window? It's like, you wouldn't just say, oh, it's troublingly contingent and arbitrary. You would also say, those are fucking rocks. That's just, that's an implausible reduction base. So, I mean, that's all I was saying. And in fact, I said almost verbatim what I just said in the video, which he paused to start yammering on about how he's confused and can't follow the words I'm saying. But anyway, let's let him continue spinning his wheels.
It's therefore necessary. If it's not contingent, it's necessary. I don't understand. And these examples of funny and boring aren't like moral statements. I don't know how he's connecting these examples with the moral realm and then making the point about implausibility.
Funniness is subjective. That's why I brought it up. Fucking dipshit.
Yeah, follow this.
Yeah, I can tell.
There was a timestamp in here. I can just actually go through and we don't actually have to watch because he was talking about it's Old Testament stuff being questionable. So it's kind of odd to place it into God. But I mean, of course, that's kind of more of an attack on Christian theism. He said, God sends supernatural snakes, commands genocide, floods the world, sends bears to maul children, etc. So I thought that was funny because supernatural snakes, what?
Seraphim.
They were just snakes and they bit people.
Seraphim.
He supernaturally sent snakes, sure, but they were supernatural snakes.
Yeah, they're seraphim, dude. They fucking fly.
Anyway. Versus like supernaturally induced snake behavior.
I don't know. Yeah, commands genocide, floods the world, sends bears to maul children. They actually weren't children. The word that it's used there to refer to those people, adults.
If they were children, you'd fucking defend it anyway. So I honestly don't give a shit. It's also disputed that they're not kids, for the record.
Yeah, Bethel already had a serious problem with God at the time. Did not have a good relationship with him at all. Children. The word that it's used there to refer to those people, adults. They were from the city of Bethel, already had a serious problem with God at the time. Did not have a good relationship with him at all. The term that's used there is actually also used for kings and generals. So if they were not like 5-year-olds that just wandered out of the, anyway. And then this next one.
It's crazy that they used the word for general and then it was just misinterpreted and the story was told incorrectly so many times that this is a thing you have to address. I mean, like, come on, man. Like, I'm not even trying to weigh into the exegetical conflict here, but like, if what you just said is right, it was clearly not like children or whatever. It's like, well, then, how did this mistake come to be? How did this spread to the point where like every apologist has to have some canned response to it? I'm saying like that is at least an argument that it's like disputable. And besides, even if you're really a divine command theorist, you should wait to find out. Speaking of contingency and arbitrariness, I mean, what if you found out tomorrow, like some just brilliant biblical scholar proves that it was kids? It was a bunch of 5-year-olds. Would you suddenly, no, you'd just change your opinion on that event. You'd say, oh, you know what? It was still good, even though it turned out to be 5-year-olds. Because you're not a moral realist.
A trivial concern. How do we know what he wants? Like, yeah, it's not a trivial concern. I'm open to plenty of suggestions. But I mean, a question isn't an argument, and it's not a problem per se. I mean, it's a problem to solve. That's not like it's some kind of intrinsic problem with the theory. I mean, there's various. But actually, how do we know? What actually, you could phrase this. We could steelman this and say maybe this is just a question on divine promulgation of commands, right? And I would just refer him to Robert Adams on that one. He has three requirements for the divine promulgation of commands.
Yeah. So the problem he's referring to, he's referring to something that is like, it's not even a full paragraph, and it's near the end of the video, where I say, like, even if God is the basis for objective morality, you look at the God of the Old Testament, it's like, it's not a good fella, right? The God of the Old Testament. And plus there's this further question of like, okay, morality is grounded in God's nature and God's commands. Okay, and what is God's nature exactly? You're about to straighten that question out. What does God command exactly? I mean, I found out earlier he commands us not to hit dogs with baseball bats. I didn't remember that part of the Bible, but he's like, oh, I guess it's not a trivial concern. But Robert Adams cleared this up. He cleared up the issue of theists disagreeing morally about what God commands. Oh, cool. I hadn't heard about that. Good to know he did that, though.
We went over that in one or two other videos.
Probably, yeah.
And that's one way, right? I mean, you see, those are more like requirements or necessary features for God's divine commands. So sort of how do we know what he wants is actually similar to asking how do we know what's right?
Yeah, it's the same
right?
thing. If he's paradigmatic, good. I mean, that's the thing. You're asking
and
it's also cool you're just reporting what I said instead of just playing it, where, I did not say or imply that there's no issues with moral knowledge if you're a secular moral realist. Like, okay, how do we know what the moral truths are? And how do we handle moral disagreement? How do we explain moral disagreement? It's a massive issue. I have a lot to say about it. I've spoken to Michael Humer about it. I've written episodes about it. So I mean, in no way do I think this is only a problem for divine command theorists. It's just, what God in fact commands is a serious problem for your view because theists disagree. And in the past, they've killed each other over these disagreements, right? But I've never said, oh, well, just become a moral non-naturalist. Now there's no questions. There's no question whatsoever about moral disagreement. I never said that. So, I mean, if you want to make this point about oh, well, you have a similar problem. Okay, go for it.
Right. And any and all epistemological theories you want to get from moral realism, we could just apply just as well, I think, to divine command theory. So I'm open to plenty of suggestions on that one. So I guess the next one would be 149.42. Is
that where I went? Okay, so we are skipping 133, 149, 42.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to address Ethan's troll comment?
Let me see.
Can you not see it when I put the comments in there?
Yeah, I'm looking at other things though.
Oh, no, I see it. I put it right here on the screen.
Defending both William and Craig and the moral argument. Yeah.
What is
Ethan, aka Spartan Theology, said it doesn't get more lame than defending both William Lane Craig and the moral argument. Ethan is a theist and a Christian who has some good opinions about things, and apparently he agrees with me about this fucking argument.
What does Ethan think? What the heck? So he also disagrees with premise 1. He's an anti-Craig bot. He's an anti-Craig activist.
Yeah.
Of Wielenberg, Humer, and others like them are even possible, then the first premise of the moral argument is false.
Oh, this is
He plays one half of one sentence. That's great.
Exactly what Clifton said about the ontological argument. Right. This is a feature of all necessary statements. Why is this a defeater?
Yeah, this is the case when you talk about the essence of anything. Like this is the case. Like you can say this for literally any view on talking about the essence of something. And yeah, so I think that all the other metaethical views are necessarily false. Yes, that's not what moral obligations are. That's not the nature of them, etc.
So just to point out that if I discover a possibility inconsistent with that necessity, that's not going to make you give up your view, because there's a threat out there that all I got to do is establish a possibility claim, and then your necessity claim's undermined.
Yeah, if you can show me that possibly the essence could be different of A, whatever A is, then yes, that the theory was wrong. You only got to show
why you bring this up all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't see why we might bring that up? Like, because you're the one saying that morality is objective only if God exists. Okay, so if anyone presents us with a possible world where morality is objective and God does not exist, which is a very low bar, then the first premise is false. So this is an argument that is quite vulnerable to refutation.
Said, okay, yeah, this is such a disadvantage of the modal ontological argument, because if the first premise is just it makes God either necessarily true or necessarily false. Okay, so what? Why is this an objection?
I don't know. I mean,
give me a reason to think it's necessarily false.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or
I think
I have, but you haven't been watching the fucking video. But anyway, it's just like, yeah, I mean, they are keying in on something where it's like, well, look, when it comes to like necessities. Okay, well, sorry, just to back up a step. This is an interesting feature. Has nothing to do with what their contribution to this has been. But an interesting thing about the modal ontological argument is it sort of gets you to think about the logical geography, for lack of a better term, of like modality and what kind of being God would have to be, you know, like if he is necessary, what kind of a necessary being is he? Because Richard Swinburne has a really good discussion, you know, about what kind of necessary being God would have to be, and he's defended it against many other theists who don't like what he has to say. And he gave a talk on YouTube that I listened to recently about this. But yeah, Swinburne is extremely based, and I want to think more about what Swinburne has to say. My own opinion is that because Swinburne is such a thoroughgoing substance dualist, and he's defended that, you know, in print in so many venues, that I think he takes the link between conceivability and possibility really seriously, and like it's obviously conceivable that God doesn't exist. And anyway, that's just my hunch. My hunch, very roughly, is that Swinburne is at odds with so many theists about you know, God's necessity because of his deep involvement in philosophy of mind, where for completely different reasons, the link between conceivability and metaphysical possibility is kind of a flashpoint, you know, and as a non-physicalist, he ends up on one side of that dispute. And if you just talk about philosophy of mind and you're a substance dualist and you've thought a lot about conceivability and possibility, you form those opinions, and then you turn to philosophy of religion and start talking about God's necessity, yeah, that's going to influence your views of God's necessity and the ontological argument and so on.
We can go to 158.
All right, we'll do this one and then wrap it up.
Yeah, this is
a real job.
Yeah.
So what's Craig's excuse? He's a philosopher and arguably the most prominent defender of the moral argument. I think the answer can be found in an interview with John D. Martin, who asked him which arguments are the most effective with students. Here's what Craig said, quote, "Interestingly enough, I think the moral argument is the most effective. I personally like the scientific and philosophical arguments based on science and cosmology, but I find that those don't really move students as much as the moral argument, which says that apart from God, there's no absolute foundation for..." Why are you laughing at Craig? That's what Craig said. Moral values. Therefore, if you're going to affirm the value of things like tolerance, love, fair play, the rights of women, and so forth, you need to have a transcendent anchor point. You need to have God. I think students are so familiar with the idea that God is dead, therefore everything is relative, that they resonate with that argument when you tell them that apart from God, there are no moral absolutes. So this argument has tremendous appeal to students. It is one to which they respond. Is it just me, or is he saying that he defends the moral argument so frequently because it's effective and not because he thinks it's a good argument?
Oh, I'm trying to sympathize with this.
Yeah. So
let me just play, because it's important what I think the moral argument is the most offensive. Here's what Craig said, quote, "Interestingly enough, I think the moral argument is the most effective. I personally like..." Interestingly enough, like the scientific and philosophical arguments. I like the scientific and philosophical arguments. So, I mean, he's saying, you know, I like the scientific and philosophical arguments, and the implication seems to be not the moral argument. I mean, that's just me reading what he's saying, unless he phrased this like really clumsily, where he's saying, which I mean is possible. He said, I like the scientific arguments based on science. So, I mean, I'm fully willing to accept that he just didn't phrase this in the way that he was really happy with. But another thing to keep in mind, when you read the quote on his website, there are like brackets at different points, like where he edited stuff. So, I mean, like this is, it's the transcript is posted on his website. He changed stuff and put stuff in brackets. Like he means what he's saying. Okay. And like, I'm willing to give leeway because it sounds like it was a spoken interview, or it was definitely a spoken interview. Yeah. So totally willing to give leeway here. But I mean, just think about what he's saying. He's like, yeah, interestingly enough, it's the moral argument. Now, I like these other arguments, the ones that are based on science and philosophy. But I've noticed students, notice he says students. I've noticed students who are kids like this argument. Okay, well, that he did not say because it's a fucking fantastic argument, because the premises are like obviously true and it's valid,
Oh, I'm trying to sympathize with this.
Yeah. So
I don't understand. I don't get this one.
I can respond to this in two sentences.
Okay.
Okay. An argument's effectiveness is a necessary component of a good argument, right?
No.
Craig says it's effective.
It depends, though. It depends because, like when I was joking around with you, I'm not going to go to like I don't know, a high school get together and go over the ontological argument. It probably won't be effective with it because they're not aware of ontology.
Yeah, and also because that argument sucks dick, and most Christians hate it.
Yeah, that's why I said it's necessary, right? So like, nowhere did Craig say it's not a good argument. In fact, he typically says it's.
Why would you pick one of the famously worst arguments for theism as your example? Like, well, I'm not going to use the ontological argument because it wouldn't be effective. Yeah, that's an argument that is not persuasive and also not a good argument. So how is that a genuine counterexample? You're mixing up two different variables there, pal.
It's probably it probably is the best argument for actually reaching people. This is what Planning says too, right? I mean, look, there are three kind of like stances, or I don't know, maybe modes, or maybe quality, like certain levels of quality.
There's a lot more than two sentences. Wait, hang on. What was the second sentence?
It probably won't be effective with it because they're not aware of ontology.
Necessary component of a good argument. Two sentences. Okay. An argument's effectiveness is a necessary component of a good argument, right? Craig says it's effective.
It depends, though. It depends because,
I guess that's the first sentence is a false statement about how all good arguments. I mean, he said it's necessary, right? I mean, you can have good arguments that aren't really convincing, persuasive, effective, but you just can't see what's wrong with them. You can have arguments that are like, really good but not effective. You can have arguments that are effective but no good. Pretty fucking obvious.
Like, nowhere did Craig say it's not a good argument. In fact, he typically says it's probably it probably is the best argument for actually reaching people. This is what Planning says too, right?
That's not in conflict with what I said. It's saying that it's the best argument for reaching people is different from saying this is a very philosophically robust argument, or like an argument that's based on philosophically robust premises.
I mean, look, there are three kind of like stances, or I don't know, maybe modes, or maybe quality, like certain levels of quality when it comes to arguments or something. There's validity, show it's valid. It's the way that obeys all the rules of inference. It's sound, which means actually it has true premises and true conclusion, or it's good, which means not only are the first two true, but you're using it in an environment that people can actually understand what you're saying, right? And actually would be receptive to it, right? So I probably, for example, wouldn't use the ontological argument in a country that was just all atheists. I probably won't. It's a sound argument, I think. I just don't think it would be a good argument there. And it turns,
So you're one of like the, minority of theists who accepts the ontological argument.
An illustration of your point.
I mean, it's not even convincing to theists, dude. Bad example.
This effectiveness point is basically what I've heard over and over again, which people advocate this, and it makes perfect sense to me. You start where people are at.
Yeah.
That's like a Socratic virtue. Like, you don't try to like impose some kind of like sound argument that you think is convincing on a person that is unfamiliar with it. You say, okay, let me figure out what this person cares about, and if I have an argument that connects with what they already care about. They're already going to be invested in where the argument goes. And guess who said this? William James. You're not in the ethics in the what's that? The will to believe. At the very beginning, he makes.
Why does he say that like it's a big reveal?
Distinction, among other things, between live and dead hypotheses, or hypotheses that are momentous to you. Okay. Okay. There's a pragmatic and an effective way to utilize that distinction and say which arguments in our arsenal, whatever you want to call it, are going to be live, momentous issues for the people with whom I'm trying to convince. If I'm also, which is what Craig and Moreland do, they're also evangelizing. There's nothing wrong with philosophizing and evangelizing. It's just it can go together.
Yeah,
it's different things, but they can go together. And so there's nothing wrong with finding an argument that really clicks with your audience and they care about it. And you can't be overly cynical about this point and just say, Craig secretly thinks that the moral argument is either invalid or unsound and still uses it because it changes mind.
I didn't say he secretly thinks it's invalid. Imagine thinking the moral argument is invalid. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values do exist. Therefore, God exists. Yeah, I'm sorry, Craig, but your argument commits the modus tollens fallacy. It's a part of the logically invalid family of arguments known as modus tollens. Yeah, and my claim is definitely that Craig secretly thinks modus tollens is invalid. That's a really fucking intelligent point you're making, MJ. Yeah, I didn't say that Craig secretly thinks it's invalid, which would be insane, or that it's unsound or something. I'm just saying he must recognize that this is like a fringe opinion that he has. Like, he must recognize that virtually all of his epistemic peers, including theists, think that he's wrong. And the only place that this has any play is in Christian apologetics. That's what Terence Cuneo said in that review of Wielenberg's book. A lot of theists think this way. And I'm saying you're doing Craig a disservice if you think that he doesn't know that. So I'm saying that he draws a distinction between lay audiences and with his philosophical peers. And I'm saying he must know his philosophical peers, including theists, think this is a bad argument. But he knows that lay audiences respond to it, so he keeps using it. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying that he recognizes that it's effective with lay audiences, even though it's not effective with his philosophical peers. And I'm saying that's why he uses it. I'm not saying he secretly thinks it's invalid, for fuck's sake, or even that it's unsound. I'm saying that he knows these premises are harder to defend than he lets on in his popular work. It's a disservice to him to think that he doesn't know that. So if he were trying to convince his epistemic peers, I don't think he would use this argument. If he's trying to convince people who he considers to be like below him, then he verifiably does use this argument.
You can't be overly cynical about this point and just say, Craig secretly thinks that the moral argument is either invalid or unsound and still uses it because it changes minds. I need some evidence for that.
Okay, how about the clips where he says that he understands himself to be doing evangelism at these fucking debates? How about that?
So he asked in the video, is it just him? I don't think it's just him. I think a lot of people think Craig's a liar or a deceiver, or who's like accidentally has these behavioral tendencies of being sleazy and slippery. Yeah. But that's not. I don't see any evidence of that when we met him. I don't see any evidence. He seems like a stalwart, like has really, really good character. That doesn't suit him at all, or what I know about him at all. Yeah. But yeah, that's all I got for that.
Well, then you're extremely gullible and not terribly reflective. Oh, I met him and he seemed nice. He wasn't wearing a name tag that said, "Hello, I'm a liar." I mean, Craig's been caught lying a couple times. I'm not saying he's like a habitual liar or something, but like he has been caught lying a couple times. That's just a fact. And, you know, he's had a very long career and people lie sometimes. And when they lie, it's usually a little complicated. It's a little messy. Okay. It's not, you know, you can have like a cartoonish, childish version of what liars are like. But the fact is there's usually a lot of self-deception and there's a lot of messiness and ambiguity and stuff. But anyway, I think that he has mentioned multiple times that he views himself as like doing evangelism. His apologetics work is like a ministry, and I just don't think it's that far-fetched if he notices that this argument works really well with lay audiences, even though he knows that it doesn't work with his epistemic peers. I mean, look, what he says in like academic journals and what he says in like popular work is very different. And none of this is to say that he secretly thinks it's invalid or unsound, but just that he's more aware of the strength of the argument and like doesn't see it as the strong argument that people like you seem to see it as. Like, I don't think that he holds the moral argument in the same high regard that you hold it in. You clearly think the moral argument is just like unassailable. And I would be very surprised if Craig sees it that way. I don't see at all why he wouldn't defend an argument that he, I'm not saying he hates the argument. I'm just saying he probably has a more accurate estimation of it than he lets on in his popular work. That does not strike me as like a wild claim. Since we know that he considers himself to be doing evangelism, and since we can assume that he knows his own epistemic peers, I mean, think about what Terence Cuneo wrote. Like, let me just pull that up again. When I read the most sophisticated discussions of God and morality, I find that none of them maintains that there could be no meaningful lives, value obligations, or reasons to be moral if God were not to exist. I found myself then puzzled by Wielenberg's choice to engage extensively and almost exclusively with a very radical theistic view that states there could be no meaningful lives, value, obligations, or reasons to be moral if God were not to exist. Admittedly, this radical view is often voiced by lay people and defended in works of Christian apologetics, but as best as I can tell, these are not the audiences to which robust ethics is addressed. Okay, so they did not end up making a part 2. This came out about 2 weeks ago, and still haven't done so. And even if they did, I'm not responding to it. I mean, this was incredibly philosophically uninteresting, tedious. They misrepresented my views at several points. They would attribute views to me that I don't hold and attack them, and sometimes they would attribute views to me that I explicitly reject in the video that they supposedly watched. So overall, very frustrating experience. I mean, it's not just that they philosophically didn't know what was going on at several points, which is true, but they were also just not understanding what was happening around them on a very basic level. Like at one point, MJ didn't know that I was quoting Craig. So, I went out on a limb with this. I don't recall ever having watched a video from Democracy of the Dead, but I was told by a couple of people, you should like hear what they have to say, maybe like go on a panel with them or something. And that's why I took the time to watch this. And I can tell you right now, I'm not going to do that unless something changes, because this was just a total waste of time. I mean, you can't know if you don't check, but like I checked. This was stupid. It was philosophically shallow. They could not be bothered to like be aware of like what was happening in the video they were responding to. They played probably, if I had to guess, less than 10 minutes of me speaking in their 2-hour response video. Which, sometimes you select clips, but they would literally one time they played half of a sentence. Very poor response overall. So that's the last time I will be engaging with these two, if I had to guess.
All right. Well, thank you, Emerson Green, for your critique, and it was fun responding to it. Hopefully I wasn't too annoying in my responses.
You were very
annoying. Chris, he's just a Thor robot. But all right. Love you guys.
So thank you for listening. I'm sorry. Why don't you listen to an episode that I scripted? I've been Emerson Green, and I will see you next time.